cry, even better if you beg. Side story 1. Already late in the night, yet still the doors to the study remained shut. Matthias had taken to staring through the small gaps of the doorway, where the light inside the room would spill into the darkened hallways. For days, this had been his routine, all because his Dukas would keep herself behind these closed doors. His hand would find itself reaching out, resting on the intricately designed wooden frames of the double doors, ready to throw them open. He could do it too, for as much as they remained closed, she never locked it. But instead, he lightly knocked on the door, hesitant on whether he should disturb her. But no answer came. He should be patient. After all, this was the last day before the final exams. She needed all the time she could get. But after pondering for a moment, Matthias eventually shrugged to himself and proceeded to open up the doors. And there she was revealed to him. Form hunched in sleep over her open notes and books that were sprawled across her desk. Her glasses lay mushed against her face. She must have fallen asleep without realizing it. And so he smiled at the adorable picture she painted for him. Even her pen was still grasped loosely on her hand, hanging treacherously on delicate fingers. He tilted his head. Was it worth it, waking her up? A fresh scent of roses wafted through the open window on an early summer breeze. He stalked stealthily closer to his sleeping wife, eyes staring intensely at her unconscious form. The breeze that flew and combed through her stray golden locks, making them flutter. He lifted a hand, lightly carding his fingers through her golden crown. She began to stir, before blinking blearily at him. "Hello, Leyla," Matthias whispered, leaning closer as he bent to her level, letting the name flow in a whisper over her fresh cheeks. Leyla groggily sat up, struggling with her disheveled hair and her glasses. "I just closed my eyes for a second," she mumbled in excuse, brushing her warm cheeks with her hands. Matthias gave no particular answer, just watched her still with a faint smile. "Oh really?" Just for a second Leyla opened her eyes again with a jerk, fumbling to come fully out of sleep without looking at Matthias. It was an amusing sight to see, to be honest. It had been almost a year since they married, still Leyla found it so puzzling why she would still feel so flustered around him. Gathering her bearings, she quickly swept up her wayward hair into a single ponytail before turning to properly look at him and saw her husband staring out at the window, and into the night sky. The stars twinkled beautifully into the night, gracing the skies with their countless presence. Its light, glittering down on the sleeping earth beneath them. But even in the dim setting, she could see him as clear as he was in daylight. His presence would never be diminished for her. He stood in the middle of the study, framed by the fluttering curtains as he stood in attention, his feet slightly apart. As much as she wanted to pay attention to the other visual luxuries in the room, she'd always remained focused on Matthias alone. "Hey, Matthew," Leyla called out of the blur, startling when he turned his head and met her eyes suddenly. The same mischievous smile hovered on his lips as he answered by flicking his chin. "Can you stop staring and get out?" she asked politely. "Are you going to sleep again?" He teased her, to which she flushed indignantly. "No," she protested immediately. The notes she had been reading had an unmistakable ink stain, which prompted her to flush further at being caught, even as she tried to act nonchalantly in front of him. "I'm going to keep studying." "Really?" He quirked up a brow at her, her blush deepened further. "Yes," she declared with conviction, before immediately flipping a page as if to show she already was. However, it only served to amuse Matthias more, making him chuckle softly at her childish indignation. "Go on then, study," he told her light-heartedly, but she only pouted when he made no move to leave. "I can't while you're here." "So?" He quirked up another brow at her. "It's not as if I'm going to be disturbing you. I'll just be here, quiet and calm." They stared at each other for a moment, before Leyla eventually relented and tried to return to her studying. But try as she might, she couldn't find it in herself to focus on the words in the pages. It was a ridiculous notion, she grumbled in her mind, studying right next to a man who was doing nothing but stare at her. She'd rather study next to her baby son, Felix, if she could choose. A frown marred her features, trying so hard to fight down the obvious flush on the face when she felt his continued gaze on her. Unable to ignore it further, she finally turned to him, speaking calmly as though his presence alone wasn't bothering her. "Please leave me alone, I need all my focus to study," she told him, and Matthias couldn't help himself but tease her. "Some honor student you are. Shouldn't you have studied for the exam in advance?" "Of course, I did," she snapped in annoyance before chiding herself for falling for his teasings again. "But even if I did," she trailed off, unable to further explain why she kept isolating herself in the study. Matthias chuckled at her speechlessness. He soon began to approach her, until his shadow now draped upon her small figure. "But what? Why, you never know," she stuttered, shrugging pathetically in nonchalance. "I might have missed something. There's always more to study," she answered meekly in a soft whisper, as though she herself wasn't convinced with her answer. Even still, she refused to lose to him and kept her eyes locked on his. She knew that even if she didn't rank first in the exams, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But holding such a esteemed position wasn't an opportunity she was eager to miss. After all, not only was she the only female student, she was also the new Duchess Herhardt, the main person of interest in the most recent scandal among the nobles. One of the many reasons she was being ignored and rejected by her peers. And she wasn't eager to lose face in front of them either. Upon her silence, Matthias eventually nodded, wordlessly relenting as though he'd read her mind. "You'll do great, Leyla," he said softly. "You've studied enough," he added, cupping her cheek as he fixed the glasses on her face. She merely looked up to him in apologetic regret, before she appeared to be relieved at his touch. Just as she began to lean into his warm palms, she immediately pulled away and shook her head. There was no time left for her to regret or relax. Matthias held his hand away, which gave her a little bit of relief, but only just. If he'd leave her alone, then she'd be so thankful. But alas, he was still in the room with her, staring at her in an indecipherable expression. She eventually looked back down, avoiding his gaze when she heard him chuckle at her once more. She'd just about enough time to look up to scold him for teasing her further when warm and soft lips had descended upon hers. Her eyes widened in pleasant surprise, before the needless want in her flared up, and her eyes fluttered close to welcome his kiss completely. Calloused hands cupped her cheeks, before deftly pulling her glasses off, setting them down on her desk and away from their line of activity. Their breaths intermingled as they sighed against and met each other's lips once more for more kisses. Knowing she did not possess the willpower to stop him, she gave in fully to her desires and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him in deeper into her. She ran her fingers through the nape of his neck, brushing up of the soft, short strands of his dark hair. They rivaled the softness of her son's bed of hair, who held the same shade as his father's. They went on kissing, unhurried and unbothered by the passing of time between their lip-locking. As soon as they were finished making out, Layla's face rivaled that of the roses with how warm her face had become. Matthias came out looking as regal as ever, looking a little too pleased with himself at the slightly dazed look she was sporting after their sensual dance of tongues. It enticed him even more to dive in for another kiss. As though sensing his desires, Leyla instinctively began to lean in closer to him, but had paused when his scent and warm breath began to pull away. She blinked back the kiss daze she'd been in, and found him replacing back her glasses, hanging them gently on the bridge of her nose. She blinked up at him in puzzlement. "You're studying, Leyla," he whispered with a minuscule smirk as he brushed his fingers across his lips. "Study hard." With those parting words, he immediately backed away. She was still reeling from their kiss, and gaped at his retreating figure in shock. Still feeling hot and bothered, she gasped at his audacity as he turned to look back at her. "Oh, so now you'll leave me alone, Duke?" She huffed at him in annoyance, both her hands resting on her hips. "Oh sure, I can completely focus now on my studies, thank you very much," she added sarcastically as she whirled back around to sit on her desk and grip the pen tightly once more. Matthias only smirked at her, tipping his head into a bow as though she was the queen and he, her servant. Eventually, she broke out into a resigned smile, unable to actually be angry with his teasings. Not when he does them so elegantly. He remained smirking at her knowingly, even as he left the study with pleasant gait. As soon as the door clicked shut, Leyla finally let out a long and drawn-out sigh of relief. Their midnight encounter had gone exactly as she expected. Try as she might to get back in that mindset of studying, the stirrings he left in her remained persistent. What an infuriating man indeed. Unable to continue, Leyla turned to cooling herself down, patting her cheeks to lessen the flush on her face. Once she felt cooled enough, she grabbed her pen once more and straightened out in her seat. It was time to resume her studies. And study hard she would. Just as her mean husband had requested. Middle. This semester, Professor Lawrence had started notifying students of their grades by hanging posters on the wall. Even the most disgruntled student wasn't willing to seek out the stern, strict professor in his own private lair. Leyla dug skillfully through the crowd of students and approached the wall. Today, when Professor Lawrence announced the grades for his exams, always the last of the semester, was also the day when the rank of the biology department was decided. "Congratulations, Duchess. You must be very happy," drawled out sarcastically by the familiar voice of Count Lehmann. He, like many, had been displeased with her, magnified only when he kept ranking second only to her in all their subject studies. The Count had made no move in hiding his distaste for the new Duchess Herhardt. After all, she was the one he would always lose to, not to mention she had no qualms in also treating him less than the way he expected to be treated. Under her gaze, he could always feel her disdain and scorn for him. It unnerved him greatly, and annoyed him all the more. Even as he dressed immaculately, and kept his hair neat, the very same eyes would stare at him. As though she saw right through him, and into his greedy heart and soul. It didn't matter if she nabbed first place again, he won't let her take this victory with ease. Seems like the new Duchess always gets what she wants, eh? Whether it be her marriage or her study. He proclaimed haughtily out loud, venom dripping with his words. A round of laughter erupted with the crowd around them. Ignoring him, she kept looking for her name, squinting lightly as she searched through the posters. She hummed pleasantly to herself when she finally located her name. Perfect score, as she hoped it would be. And with that, Leyla von Herhardt was the top student for yet another semester. "You're very kind, Count, to being the first to congratulate me so earnestly." She looked at him with equal haughtiness, mirroring her husband's stance and poise. Her voice trembled a little, but she did not let it stop her. Because unlike the previous semester, where she was trying to avoid making enemies, the Count had done something that greatly earned her ire. He dared insult Felix in front of her. Any other mistake, and she might try and gain a mutual understanding with the Count. But not anymore. "You seem to be more generous than I thought, always giving me more opportunities to be the first rank in every semestral finals." She smiled tersely at him. "I shall enjoy this vacation immensely. Have a great summer." She finished, and nodded to the Count, ignoring the way his face flussied red in anger. Leyla clasped her hands lightly together and gave a polite greeting to her fellow students, stepping gracefully and cheerfully down the sidewalk by the posters, almost as if she were skipping in her steps. It didn't matter in the end how rude the Count had been. Everything was going well for her. From being the only woman in their year, and becoming its top student, down to finally becoming the new Duchess Herhardt, her luck had finally changed. With such blessings her way, the Count was nothing more than just mere inconvenience. And so she quickly trotted up to her bike, which had been parked in front of the magnificent school building she just came out of. It was decked with a row of massive columns, and showcased expert masonry. Additionally, every niche it had its own elegantly sculpted statues of the famous scientists and scholars to date. With one last look at her school, she wasted no time pedaling back, with her leather sling bag shaking along with her enthusiasm. The pedals beneath her feet were firm and reliable, and she all but basked in the sensation of the wind against her face, while her wheels rolled across the pavement. It was another point of talk, seeing the prominent Duchess Herhardt traveled by the bicycle. Such outrage it was, that every single novella in Rats had to give their 2 cents in, much like the previous duchesses of the Herhardt family, Matthias' grandmother and mother. But Matthias wasn't bothered, and that's all she cared about. And so she was free to love and enjoy her daily bike rides, especially when Matthias gifted her one once he realized how uncomfortable she was at being driven to school. Albeit embarrassed at first to raise such trivial concern, she had been more embarrassed and wrecked with worry at what he and his family would think upon seeing her on a bike instead. But he only laughed at her worries, and told her he did not care for either, and so she shouldn't as well. Eventually, Leyla finally turned into a corner, filling her nose with a sweet scent as she rode through the park atop her silver bike. It wasn't the quickest way back to the manor, that was through downtown Boulevard, but she loved oasing through here. The path was beautiful, a pleasing sight to tie eyes, which reminded her much of the forests back in Arvis. The old and wizened trees, whose barks twisted up the more it grew, arched overhead, covering her in a beautiful intricate shade from the sun, despite being less dense than the one in Arvis. She'd go the extra mile because she loved being back in that nostalgic view of nothing but woodlands and its daily treasures. She loved the woods so much that she had decided to spend her first summer vacation as a college student in the Arvis Beef. The anticipation made today's ride even more thrilling. Matthias had offered to take her on a late honeymoon, but Leyla wasn't willing to leave Felix. Besides, no place could be better than Arvis. The home of the Eternal Heart, it was called, a beautiful forest with precious memories that could cover countless wounds and sadness. Leyla had biked slowly through the beautiful path, but as she left the park and the entrance to the mansion became visible down the road, she picked up the pace. Today Matthias didn't work long, he would already be ready to see her. Leyla knew she'd have to brag. It seemed childish, but she wanted to do it, just once. She thought she could brag to Matthias, her husband. She was greeted by a middle-aged maid, fighting against a smile provoked by the bicycle. "The master is in the garden," the maid hinted, in a polite tone. "With the young master? With Felix?" Leyla opened her eyes in a bit of surprise, then burst into laughter. Matthias's ridiculous suggestion of going on a honeymoon and leaving Felix behind had probably been a joke. She crossed the hall toward the garden, her single braid of hair swinging to the motion of her brisk steps as she moved down the marble floor accompanied by the rhythmic beat of her footsteps. She was looking forward to seeing her husband and son together. She was looking forward to seeing his sweet side. Leyla reached the garden behind the mansion before she knew it, her mind busy trying to imagine the scene she was about to find. As she entered the promenade, the wind blew a strong scent of roses across her path. She breathed the perfumed air unconsciously, her eyes lit up with eagerness. But even though she didn't notice the beauty of the rich garden, full of the best tints of green, framed by a profoundly blue sky, unconsciously it filled her with happiness and made her walk light and joyous. Father and son, looking just alike, only one smaller than the other, were near the garden pagoda, under the crest of a rose vine in full bloom. As she spotted them together there, Leyla burst inadvertently into cheerful laughter that resounded through the sunlight-filled garden. Matthias turned his head slowly, hearing her laugh. The eyes of the attendant standing next to him, reporting something, also headed toward Leyla. Her gaze went past them, reaching her son standing by a column of the pagoda on the other side. Felix von Herhardt stared intelligently at his father with his hands clasped behind his back, as serious as if he understood every word of the conversation with the secretary. Standing confidently under the pagoda's arch, he looked to his fond mother's eyes as if he were ready to conquer the world with his chubby fists. Matthias followed Leyla's eyes towards Felix, and only then did he smile slightly, as if he'd seen the boy for the first time. The secretary stepped quietly away, leaving only the family of three under the pagoda. "See?" Leyla cheerfully approached her husband. "You couldn't leave Felix any more than I could." Felix, hearing his mother's voice, ran waddling to hug her, giving vent to his delight in a string of broken baby talk. Matthias watched the two admiringly, laying down the documents he'd been holding on the edge of the table. He decided not to say that bringing Felix out to see him had been completely the nanny's idea. Leyla looked so radiantly happy, he almost wished it had been his idea. "I've got something to tell you," Leyla said, hugging and lifting Felix. Her eyes shone freshly into Matthias's from across the table. "But guess what it is first," she challenged, as calmly as she could. Matthias smiled. She looked at him as though she was making him guess a difficult riddle, though he was sure he already knew. "Well." Instead answering her outright, Matthias frowned a little, as if in thought, stalling "Yo, make her squirm." Felix imitated his father and, becoming serious, stopped pulling on his mother's braid. "What is it? Tell me, Leyla," Matthias said, leaning in closer to the table, committing himself to the conversation. Leyla smiled shyly, her cheek tinted red, Matthias's color, the color of the Herhardt family. "Leyla." Matthias's lips curved insensibly into a smile as he hummed the name. "Leyla. My Leyla," he thought with satisfaction. "Cry, even better if you beg." Side Story 2. The Herhardt family's users, under the direction of their butler Hessen, created a line in front of their opulent car as soon as the train from the capital arrived at Karlsbad station. People watching cast puzzled looks as the train doors opened and the young Herhardt family patriarch, the Duchess, and their kids stepped out. "Good morning, my lord." Hessen, as always, greeted his master with the utmost deference and courtesy, as did the other employees, who all lowered their heads, out of custom. Leyla unconsciously grabbed Matthias' arm tightly as a result of her unease with the attention she wasn't used to. People crowded the platform in front of the opulent vehicle like honeybees around their queen, all hoping to get a peek of the action. Matthias didn't say anything as he received the gracious welcome, standing next to Leyla, who was breathing deeply to calm herself. He gave off the immaculate, controlled aristocrat impression that Karlsbad locals had come to anticipate by appearing at ease and unconcerned by the presence of observers. As the onlookers gawked in astonishment, Matthias confidently walked forward. His nonchalant attitude towards the crowd made his act of escorting his wife even more striking and attractive. The onlookers naturally stepped back to clear a path for them to pass by. They could not see any signs of scandal or flawed relationships in the couple's demeanor. The Duchess, Leyla von Herhardt, was elegantly dressed in a blue flowing summer dress and appeared as a young woman of her age, just like the lovely child of Arvis, Leyla Rimmer, who was raised by the family's gardener. Curious looks from the throng were aimed towards the tiny Duke in the nanny's arms as she trailed the Duchess. The young child's blue eyes flashed all about, beaming with delight, stealing the attention of crowd. This occasion appeared to put an end to any rumors that the Duke had damaged the family's reputation by having a child with a low-class woman and raising questions about the child's paternity. Felix von Herhardt waved enthusiastically to the audience, making them grin as he stepped off the platform. Karlsbar has officially entered summer, someone in the throng whispered. Several voices responded in unison like a chorus, yes, it has. The Herhardt family, the renowned citizens of the northern city, would return during this summer, like a magnificent work of art being unveiled. Middle. Do you remember the gift you promised me? Leyla, who had been absorbed in looking out the car window, turned her head and suddenly asked. Matthias answered with a small tilt of his head. There was no need for them to exchange further glances as he had been keeping a steady gaze on his wife the entire time like a sunflower directed to the sun. We will be having a picnic over the weekend, the three of us together, she reminded him of the promised plan. Leyla's gaze grew more intense as Matthias continued to be silent. Matthias seemed to dwelling in her emerald eyes at that moment, which seemed a little darker and deeper than normal. Leyla announced, her enthusiasm and pleasure for her excellent marks audible in her voice. There's present I'd want to get. She smiled broadly and said, I want to go on a picnic, the three of us, to the Arvis forest. I'll take you to see the flower fields this time, Leyla said, emphasizing the word this time to convey a deeper meaning. Arvis has many beautiful flowers in the summer too, she added with a smile, and Matthias nodded in agreement. Leyla, do you know what your words mean to me? They assure me that those happy days were not just a dream or a deception. Leyla's expression grew serious. Don't pretend like you don't know, she said, studying his face closely. Don't tease me, she added with a hint of disbelief. She spoke confidently and his voice carried the same firmness as when she scolded Felix. Unlike their son, his father simply chuckled without shame, leaving Leyla feeling hollow like a well devoid of water. Leyla, I remember, I do. His melodious voice made Layla's lips quiver. Every element of you, every inch of you. His eyes were silent and deep. He was no longer beaming. Leyla would occasionally experience despair when she heard him say this in a cool, contained manner. I am mindful of your constant sarcasm. Leyla talked louder than she had hitherto. Matthias masterfully answered while keeping Leyla in his gaze. Are you sure? He fixed Leyla with a stare that seemed to portray his will to not be captivated by her. Leyla, though, was ultimately the one who again avoided eye contact. Despite the fact that these occurrences have increased lately and are both delightful and unpleasant at the same time, like the two poles of magnet, she did not feel strongly about them. The car they were in turned into the Platanus Road and headed for the mansion's great entrance while she waged war to make sense of the complicated and ill-defined feelings she was feeling. Leyla stared out the car window with a pleasant expression on her face despite her internal anguish, hoping to find the answer in the deep blue sky. Watch, Felix. Is it not wonderful? Leyla gently held Felix and pointed him in the direction of what she was pointing at with her hand. The Platanus forest wipes a variety of hazy plants. The young child spoke excitedly, using the terminology his mother had taught him. Leyla, who was helping him with his pronunciation, laughed, and the child in turn laughed too. Their laughter made the summer in Arvis seem even more beautiful, bringing back life to it. Hearing the joyful voices of the two of them, Matthias' gaze wandered to the road where her fallen bicycle during a summer past had shaken his life. The memories rushed back. He vividly remembered the spinning wheels, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the pounding of his heart that overwhelmed him during that moment. Every part of his existence was saturated by the desire to linger and disappear. And Matthias treasured these lovely moments because they had become a part of who he was now. After leaving the Platanus Road, the car entered the estate by driving past the ornate front gate. At the mansion's front door, Norma and Matthias's mother, the two duchesses, were waiting. As the automobile comes to a stop, Felix's nanny casually handed him over to them. Welcome home, Matthias. Norma smiled broadly and greeted her grandson, saying, and you too, Leyla, she continued. Even when she looked at Leyla, her expression was as kind as ever. The reception was quite different from what it was like last summer. Leyla von Herhardt, who had previously made no attempt to conceal her disdain for her daughter-in-law, was displaying a relatively gentle attitude today. As Leyla prepared to enter the main hall, she couldn't help but glance towards the far end beneath the stairs, the same spot where a young orphan girl once stood, her gaze filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity as she looked upon the young duke. It would have been unimaginable for the young girl to conceive that she would one day ascend to the rank of duchess. The world was unpredictable in beautiful ways. If anyone had made such a claim to her during her childhood, she would have deemed them insane. Yet future knew no rules. In fact, she still struggled to come to terms with it. She still thought she was dreaming. To exist in this dazzling epoch, as the wife of a man who could only be her partner in secret, Leyla von Herhardt, was an unusual and perplexing concept. There were moments when she found it hard to reconcile, feeling as though her life was but a fantastical dream. It was only through Matthias, who constantly served as a grounding force, that she was able to return to a sense of reality. "Let's go, Leyla." At the sound of a voice that was like a familiar beacon, Leyla slowly lifted her head in response. Her senses were heightened by taking a deep breath. Together, they walked into the Duke's hall, Leyla slowly and carefully climbing the steps, her mind occupied by the plans she had for this summer. The grand marble staircase and dazzling chandelier lights still held an intimidating presence to her. She thought about the idea of having a picnic with the three of them, perhaps taking a walk along a path lined with wild roses, or visiting the fields of violets and the birchwoods at the end of the road. She believed it would be nice to see the flock of waterbirds flying over the Schilter River at sunset. But the place where the vista appears most picturesque is on the striking tree that grows alongside the river. However, would that be a feasible possibility for Matthias von Herhardt? Even though she knew it was a preposterous thought, Leyla gave it serious consideration. "Hey, Matthew," Leyla whispered his name, and Matthias directed his gaze towards her. "Are you able to climb a tree?" she asked in a hushed tone, mindful of the possibility that the two leading duchesses might overhear her. The wrinkles on Matthias's forehead, which had been smooth till now, deepened. "I can teach you if you don't know how," Leyla said, with a straight face, even though the idea was absurd. "Do you want to climb it with me?" Because he found it difficult to accept what he was hearing at this moment, Matthias had been distracted for some time. Leyla's eyes were fixed intently on him even at that precise moment, only to get her answer. "I'm not pressuring you," Leyla continued, embarrassed at the last minute. "I'll abide by your wishes." Leyla felt like she was sinking deeper and deeper into the muck as she talked, but there was no turning back. The two eventually arrived at the center of the hallway that led from the central staircase to the reception area. "I'll do as you say," Matthias responded unexpectedly and lowered his head courteously. Leyla's expression was bewildered. "Never do it." Silently shouting, Leyla pleaded with Matthias, but he didn't appear to hear her. "My queen," he said softly in her ear, making her blush in shame. Matthias continued to casually twirl despite her clear disdain, a scowl engraved on his features. It was an odd circumstance. Leyla eventually burst into joyous laughter, which only confirmed the Norma and Elise's suspicions. They turned around to look at her, and Leyla soon realized why their eyes were fixed on her alone. Duke Matthias von Herhardt, who had quickly changed his expression, stood tall and looked down at her as if he didn't understand why his wife was laughing. "Felix, your mother seems to be in a very good mood today," said Elise, turning to her grandson in her arms and choosing to comment instead of scold. Leyla couldn't explain the reason for her laughter, but it didn't seem fair to laugh alone. Matthias smiled nonchalantly again when his eyes met Layla's gaze. She had to resist the urge to shout and let everyone know the real reason for her laughter. She tightened her grip on her cheeky husband's arm. She wanted to tell the world it was him, her Matthew, the subject of her happiness. It was him who made her laugh, it was him who made her happy, yet she chose customary silence over the avalanche of words. Nonetheless, it was going to be a very long summer. Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 3. A wooden cabin appeared amid the clamor of chirping birds like an ancient forgotten shrine in the rumble of the forest road. Leyla took off her hat that she had been wearing like a crown and took in the landscape in front of her like a fresh air, admiring the facade of the cabin's ageless beauty. The building's construction was unaltered and untouched, although abandoned for a long time. The two duchesses planned to raze the abandoned cabin that belonged to Uncle Bill and construct a garden for leisurely outdoor tea parties, but Matthias strongly opposed their idea. Upon hearing the news about the cabin's alteration, Leyla inquired about Matthias's plans for Uncle Bill's cabin. Why do you ask that of me? As he sat at his desk in the study, Matthias questioned while keeping his gaze fixed on her. He calmly continued, going against his wish, turning his attention back to the pile of papers in front of him. It is absolutely up to you what you desire to do with it, he said. Leyla was perplexed by Matthias's statements once more as he talked calmly. Are you claiming ownership of Uncle Bill's cabin? She inquired, attempting to steal her answers. Upon hearing his wife's innocent queries, he met her eyes and gave a fleeting nod, yet his posture remained erect. Leyla didn't really understand the significance of his simple gesture until the room started to fill with the deafening sound of papers turning. Matthias's demeanor remained serene as he made eye contact with her and nodded his head briefly. It was only after the sound of papers flipping filled the room that Leyla comprehended the meaning of his concise gesture. Leyla traversed the front yard as fast as her feet could take her, glancing at the golden watch on her pale wrist as she made her way towards the cabin. The clock said she still had some time for the tea, which was arranged with Duchess Norma. As she entered the impeccably maintained ageless cabin, she took a slow, thorough look around. There was a few furniture left. The cabin was empty like a well devoid of water. The only remaining furniture was covered in white fabric like a corpse, while all other belongings had been gathered and moved to their mansion in Rats. Leyla found herself awfully lonely the moment she stepped into the cabin. She got devastated, the loneliness stretched into torture and the atmosphere around her got unbearable. Leyla rushed and stepped out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. There, she found the two seats, mismatched in size and color yet placed in their original positions as they always used to be. Leyla turned toward the huge wooden chair that was next to her and took a seat. She had the impression that she could see Uncle Bill smoking the pipe in the wind while seated in a bent position. Although it seemed phantom at first, then she actually thought she could hear him calling her name and laughing in a cheerful manner. Uncle Bill arrived, filling the empty space with his pleasant smiles and loud voice. I am fulfilling your wish by attending college, just as you wanted. While all my classmates are male, however, your Leyla is excelling and exceptional. Are you pleased with my achievements? Leyla spoke in a cheerful voice to Uncle Bill, as she had done on other occasions when they had conversed while sitting next to one another, just like the good old times. She told several anecdotes, like a happy child who joyfully chatted with her father when he got home from work about his day. She told him about Felix's school life, Matthias the man, her husband. The more frequently the voice shook, the more at ease her enchanting smile was. Felix is thriving and growing up strong. It feels like just yesterday that he took his first steps in the shoes you bought him, but now he can run and speak eloquently. I'm sure you already know. I wish I could have another child to wear those shoes, but Matthias is opposed to the idea. He doesn't want another child. Leyla's face dropped, her smile vanishing into the howling wind while confessing the sorrow of her heart she had been carrying for long. I'll return shortly. Leyla stood from her seat, spilling agony with her face. The long afternoon sun cast shadows over the empty, old chair where she was seated. Father, you are so dear to my heart and I love you the most. The words she spoke with affection lingered into the thin air as she gently dropped beneath porch. Along the way through the woods, Leyla accelerated her pace. The wind was howling. It was blowing the woodland aggressively. The white dress hem that Leyla got herself adorned with floated softly in the direction of wind, to eastward. Although she hadn't made a single decision regarding the cabin, she was certain of one thing. While penetrating through wind in the woods, Leyla halted for a moment and fixed her steely gaze heavenwards with sheer determination. She got her answer she was eagerly looking for, creating a space where Uncle Bill would be happy. Your Leyla is a grown-up now. She would make you happy, she would make you laugh. She whispered to herself, joyous as if she finally conquered the answer of the dilemma she was caught in. Middle. In front of the Shelter River, which had a road leading into the forest, the luxury car transporting the Duke family came to a halt. The disciplined, beforehand prepared servants gave their masters a befitting reception, pretending to be overjoyed upon receiving their masters. Matthias was the first to exit the vehicle as the driver hurried to open the door in the back seat. He was as dapper as ever in a cream linen suit. It was the exact likeness of Duke Herhardt, who was well known for being free of fault and epitome of perfection. As the servants looked on, a small foot adorned with a decorated strap emerged from the open car door. The driver, who had been approaching as usual, was startled and straightened up. Duke Herhardt did not delegate his wife's escort to others. This was a widely known fact among all users of Arvis. Who would have imagined that forest girl, raised by a gardener, would grow up to be a duchess? The people who recalled the girl, Being Arvis' child, were taken aback by Matthias and Leyla. With no faint trace of awkwardness, Leyla held the Duke's hand as she exited the vehicle. Her silk skirt's wide flare was wavy, matching her soft gesture. A bright smile of Leyla, envying sunshine, flared in the green eyes as she glanced at the surroundings. "What a beautiful day it is," the Duke's wife said with joy, causing a gentle softening of his features, letting his lips to make a curve and welcome a sweet smile. In that moment, the atmosphere around him transformed. Until then, he had been the epitome of the ideal dictator, cold as ice and drained of any sort of emotion. His face was flat, his words were lifeless, while he depicted a programmed robot. People who gathered to welcome thought he might have changed a bit, but they soon realized that the slight shift in demeanor was only allowed in the presence of Leyla von Herhardt, the love of his life. The gap, previously like incontinence, became a shield, giving the man's life a more substantial appearance. The waiting servants walked after the Duchess as they started to walk side by side. The route through the woodland remained quiet despite the high number of people traveling. This allowed Leyla to hear the birds and winds more clearly as she carefully raised her head. While Matthias was moving gently and keeping his eyes focused, Leyla was looking for traces of exotic birds and the chirp she was dearly fond of. Leyla saw the face, whose appearance changes any time like an ashen shadow collided with the light of 1,000 suns combined. She didn't realize nor took a heed to notice that his gaze was aimed at her. She met his eyes reciprocating his gesture, leaving her starstruck. Leyla's eyes widened and screamed, yet her mouth chose to stay quiet. Although it was a little different from her initial assumption, she refrained from bringing it up. It's a joyful moment which she couldn't afford to ruin. Leyla followed her desire and smiled and established eye contact with Matthias once more. She then turned to face her son, who was riding in the stroller being pushed by the nanny. Felix, who had been complaining about having to ride in the stroller, was now grinning and looking around as if he had never done so, overjoyed by the moment, unlike anyone else. Leyla's heart exploded with desire to hold her son, yet she forced herself to resist the impulse to approach the child right away as she straightened her posture. It ached her heart, yet her posture was equally important to keep up. She knew her life was led by rules and customs. She must behave with poise and not carelessly pick up a child in front of the maids. She was cognizant of the fact that the order in Arvis differed from that of the Rat's mansion. She knew that, just like the two duchesses, she and her family should respect the rules during their stay in Arvis. This was the meaning behind the Duchess's words that the next Duke of Herhardt should embrace tradition. Upon arriving at the picnic area, Leyla couldn't help but be amazed wholeheartedly. "Wow," she exclaimed. The stream, where she used to rest after picking raspberries, had been transformed into a completely unfamiliar place. On the spacious picnic mat nestled in the shade of the tree, Leyla saw many unfamiliar and exotic sights. A brazier boiling tea, delicate pottery and silverware, cushions and blankets, and fresh flowers in a vase. Despite choosing the picnic spot herself, she couldn't shake off the feeling of being in a strange place. "It appears as though a room from the mansion has been transported here." She spoke gravely, but Matthias merely grinned back. With such a sweet expression, his face resembles a calm stream of water. Perhaps that explains why she keeps feeling dizzy any time she sees him. "I'm grateful." Despite the fact that the picnic would be very taxing, Leyla decided she would not miss today's enjoyment. "For honoring your commitment." She always trusted him when he made a commitment. Regardless of what anybody says, forever. He nevertheless kept his word. He was a man of his words. Matthias responded by holding her cheek and reaching out to stroke it. Leyla quickly glanced around after saying that. Her heart started beating like a drum, resisting slowing down, not even after his touch left her cheek that remained there only for a fraction of a second. She found the light in her heart against the dark heart, which she had only realized after the gloomy shade of her shame and dread. Yet there was more to reveal, and to reveal it she required a lot of bravery. "Mathy." Leyla softly called out to Matthias, who was walking ahead, causing him to turn around. She hesitated before finally saying, "It's just that. The weather is nice, don't you think?" She knew she was being silly, but she couldn't think of anything else to say. Matthias sat under the shade of a tree, appearing calm as the servants began to move about efficiently in the summer forest. Leyla approached him, still wearing her hat, the weight of her agony heavy upon her. She couldn't bear to take it off, not yet. The news arrived at the end of tea, delivered by the servants. While they were shocked by the unexpected words, Matthias remained collected. "Are you really going to dismiss all the servants, even the nanny?" Leyla asked, struggling to believe it. But Matthias' answer did not waver. "Yes," he replied, his gaze drifting over the stunned faces of the servants before returning to the attendant. "You have all done an excellent job in preparing. 6 o'clock, be back here to tidy up." With a simple gesture, Matthias checked the time by raising his cuff, effectively cutting off the attendant's protest. "It should be enough." Leyla looked around in a daze. When even the nanny, who had handed Felix over to his mother's arms, retired, they were left alone in this forest. The words were spoken in a euphemistic tone, but the message was clear. Despite feeling uncomfortable, Mark Evers eventually submitted to his owner's will. Under his command, the servants began to depart, like a low tide receding. "Can you do this?" Leyla asked in a jolt, meaning to break the rules by being unaccompanied by staff as the Duke and Duchess. But Matthias only looked at her with confusion, as if he didn't understand the meaning of her question. It was then that Leyla realized that her husband was the owner of this place, the Lord of Arvis. Leyla had much to say, but couldn't find the words. Matthias usually honored the wishes of his grandmother and mother, but only in regards to the work he chose to do. She knew better than anyone else how, when he made another decision, he would follow through with his own will. Leyla spoke inanely to Felix in an effort to divert her attention. Under Matthias' close observation, it was difficult to avoid feeling self-conscious. She felt ashamed since Matthias was constantly observing her and she assumed he wanted to be intimate since they were by themselves. Matthias started to talk as she responded tensely to the sound of him setting down his teacup. "Take it off now, Leyla." "Cry, even better if you beg." Side Story 4. Leyla, turning her head in surprise, getting priced of 100 pricks by the deep blue eyes of a man who seemed untroubled. He looked devoid of emotions like an iceberg just like the days old. She wondered if he still had any feelings left. What? I in a place like this?" she roared, shattering the peacefulness of the forest. Her hands, which quickly covered Felix's ears, were also trembling slightly. How can you say that? Felix is here." Leyla was trying to come up with a response when Matthias abruptly reached out and loosened the ribbon knot she had put under her chin. Leyla didn't realize it until she opened her instinctively closed eyelids. In a casual fashion, Matthias handed her the cap he had removed. He once more picked up the teacup that he had just calmly set down earlier. Leyla, belatedly comprehending the situation, looked at him with a slight daze. It seemed absurd to ask, as if he had suddenly become a terrible person. Matthias' relaxed appearance, sipping tea and enjoying the forest view, seemed even more absurd. Matthias looked up at the sky between the thick branches of oak trees and remarked, "No more than a hat." "I am a gentleman, Leyla. I know the rules," he assured her. When she thought of his words, Layla's brow wrinkled. "Is making jokes like this amusing?" "Well, it's funny," he chuckled. Matthias shifted his straining gaze back to Leyla. "You look lovely. When you're blushing, you look even more attractive." There was no smile on his face when he uttered such horrible comments. Leyla commented sarcastically, "It's extremely gentlemanly of you to say this in the midst of the day." Matthias answered, leaning boldly against a stack of cushions, "A gentleman," he continued, "a gentleman befitting a serene queen." Through the leaves, the sun's shadow drifted slowly over his beaming face. Due to his untidy stance, perhaps, the mood of the day seemed to relax a little. Leyla didn't despise having to face the person she knew so well in this situation. She did, however, experience an odd sensation of injustice. "I'm not incorrect," Leyla confidently disputed while stroking her scorching cheeks. "Scientists are expected to make decisions based on their experience." "Experience?" questioned Matthias. "Yes. And from what I've seen so far, everything you say always ends up having the same meaning as what I've misunderstood. Just as in science, I'm making judgments based on my own experience." Matthias watched his wife blather on, his eyes narrowing with intrigue. "What is the scientific verdict, then?" he asked. Leyla said, her big eyes gleaming over her glasses, "You're the evil one, and you're the one who's bad." "The Duke, you crow!" Leyla yelled angrily while continuing to blush brilliantly. Soon after, Matthias' laughter was blown by the wind through the dense woodland and across the estate. He didn't intend to chuckle, but Leyla decided to stop objecting to it. Only when she was looking at him did Matthias von Herhardt smile like this, and it was okay that they were both laughing in private and alone. They engaged in mundane conversations and ate delicious food together. They also took a leisurely walk, side by side, without caring about anyone's gaze. As she savored these trivial moments, one by one, Leyla realized it again, her wishes were hidden behind the wounds inflicted by him. This wasn't a particularly special or grand picnic. She hated herself for the weakness and anticipated it for countless days while knowing she shouldn't have. But her own dumb heart was probably what she detested the most. Despite the fact that Leyla was well aware that it went against Uncle Bill's standards, she found it painful to love a man who deserved to be loathed. Leyla averted her sight to the faraway sky while observing the road where the tree shadows were lengthening. It wasn't long before it was almost time to go back. "It's nearly time to return," she remarked. Leyla sighed unhappily as she looked at the clock. Felix, who was being held by his mother, was sound sleeping, possibly exhausted after a fun-filled day. The kids' clothes were covered in red stains from eating foraged raspberries, which brought back pleasant picnic memories. Matthias looked up at the distant sky before turning to face her. Layla's eyes softened instantly, as though she were buried in concentration. "I believe a day is too brief." "That's sad," stated Leyla. "We can come again." Matthias spoke seriously, lowering his rolled sleeves to adjust the cuffs. "Really?" Leyla questioned with a serious expression and eagerness, unable to conceal her excitement. Matthias was now aware. Leyla was pleading for confirmation with her words. "Really," Matthias assured. He vowed that when the time came, Layla's smile would be as radiant as the sun. Similar to how it is right now. Similar to this, nothing in her eyes that was other than him at this very moment could have been lovelier in his eyes. The servants came back as Matthias adjusted his tie and put on his jacket. They needed to get back to being the Duke and Duchess of her heart. The two strolled side by side as they left the forest, being followed by a nanny and servants who were carrying Felix, who was asleep. When they arrived to the road where the waiting car was parked, their summertime outing, which appeared to be coming to an end at this point, suddenly took another unexpected turn. "Go back first," Matthias told the driver, who had unlocked the backseat door and was waiting. "What? That suggests?" Confounded, Leyla inquired. Matthias said with a wink to the nanny holding Felix, "We're going to walk." When the nanny realized what was being said, she hurried to put Felix in the car. Matthias ignored Layla's embarrassed glances as she turned to face him. In the meantime, the nanny's and Felix's automobile sped off. Leyla would have immediately inquired if the housekeepers weren't keeping an eye on her. But she refrained from speaking and instead took Matthias' hand. Naturally, he took her to the Shelter River's golden banks. As they crossed the forest path, Leyla yelled, "Matty, look!" loudly. She felt a little silly when Matthias casually remarked, "You said you were unhappy." "But this is," she said, her eyes darting over the glistening sky, the adjacent woodland, and the tranquil current before returning to Matthias' face. "Felix must be worn out. He must take a nap." He made a joke, and Leyla laughed. "Do you not despise Felix?" "Why would I dislike him? After all, he is my son," Matthias retorted, dipping his head slightly downward. He instinctively cared for his son, but that love wasn't the same as the one he had for Leyla. He had no desire to dispute this. The only person who would be in his life forever was Leyla, the only person he could truly love. Leyla, who had been gazing at him for some time, smiled and nodded her head. Matthias went slowly alongside the Shelter River while holding her hand. Leyla frequently made stops along the river to point out the birds. Her voice had a crisp, echoing quality to it that resembled the sounds of singing birds as she told him the names and qualities of the birds and flowers. "Look. Watch that bird, please. Matty." A bird with vibrant feathers was flying in the skies, as Leyla pointed out. The bird she wished to show Matthias, though, quickly vanished past the river, like it only appeared in her visions. "Ah, it's gone." Leyla looked at the riverside where the bird flew off with a saddened expression sounding like a child who got ripped away from her favorite toy. "Did you know that Arvis is home to a variety of unusual flowers and birds? Arvis is comparable to heaven on earth, according to Professor Lawrence." Leyla clasped Matthias' hand once more and pointed up into the sky. He, in response, firmly grasped her tiny hand. Leyla sighed. That bird earlier was incredibly hard to see. "Would you like me to get it for you?" Matthias questioned softly while keeping his eyes glued to the direction in which the bird had gone. He continued, his voice even more collected, "So that you can retain it." Leyla gave him a hearty smile as she shook her head and gazed at him with big eyes. "No," she firmly exclaimed. "Why? Ornithologists typically do that, right?" Matthias inquired. She hesitated before answering. It was accurate to say that catching and stuffing exotic birds served as a study tool. Also, she was quite fond of Professor Lawrence, who also owned a number of stuffed birds. "Don't fool around like that, please." Leyla stated in a commanding tone. She chose to interpret it that way even though she knew it wasn't a joke. Even if it was required, she had no desire to bring home a fresh stuffed Arvis for her study. Fortunately, Matthias acknowledged her choice and grinned pleasantly. They arrived at Leyla's favorite tree by the river as they continued their journey. "Would you like to ascend there?" Leyla questioned as she regarded the tree like an old friend. "The view of the shelter river from the top of this tree is the most beautiful vista in the world you would ever get to see. Is this really required?" Matthias laughed as he asked, turning to face the tree branch where Leyla used to sit in the old days. "Of course. The view of the shelter river from the top of this tree is unparalleled in beauty. Believe me." Leyla approached the tree. In contrast to her cautious face, she began to climb it with a bold and agile pace. Sitting on a thick branch stretching out to the riverside, Leyla grinned up at him. "Come on, Matthew. You can do it like me. I'll hold your hand," she shouted, sounding like she really wanted to teach him how to climb. Matthias laughed when she extended her tiny hand to him. He then took a step forward and began to climb the tree without her assistance. As he got to the top, he pulled her deep into his arms. Leyla could feel his heart racing in time with her own while resting her back against his chest. "You really can do anything, can't you?" Leyla whispered in awe, nestled in Matthias' embrace. "Not everything," Matthias replied, his lips brushing into a smile as he looked out at the river below. "For you 1,000 times over," he said in a whisper. Leyla couldn't help but blush at his words, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment and the feeling of being loved by this amazing man in her life. She looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "I knew it. You're a pro at climbing trees." Matthias chuckled, enjoying the feeling of Leyla's warm body pressed against his. "It's not my first time," he admitted, "but it's not something I do often." Leyla smiled, content to be wrapped up in Matthias' embrace. Everything about this moment with this man was nice for her, even his smile and the warmth of the massive, strong body encircling her. She no longer wanted to conceal or refute it because it was the most honest thought. They perched on the branches and looked down at the glistening river, calm and serene. The moment belonged to them while the world chose not to interrupt. The moment was drenched in simplicity yet shining bright with divinity. Leyla couldn't help but feel grateful for the moment they shared, sitting on the tree by the river as the sun set. It was moments like these that she treasured, feeling close to him and at peace. They sat on a tree with a view of the shelter river as the sun started to drop. A flock of birds was gliding lazily above the surface of the water, which was shimmering in golden hues. "What do you think?" Leyla turned to face Matthias, her eyes gleaming with eagerness. "Isn't it beautiful?" Her pride in the scenery could be seen in the way Matthias peered intently into her green eyes. As much as he could concur with such a viewpoint. "Yes, it's beautiful." As he whispered, his lips touched her lips in a passionate kiss. Although startled, Leyla wrapped her fingers around Matthias's neck and gave him a kiss in response. Her hand went up to feel the contours of his face, quickly found itself digging into his hair. She was flushing a rich rose color, slathered in joy, her face, ecstatic. After the long kiss that had flowed like a silent stream had finally come to an end, Matthias gently wiped his wife's lips with a silk handkerchief. His lips softened into a content smile, like the evening air on a summer night. "I promised that I would teach you how to swim on the weekends," he said. "Swimming?" He gazed at the water for a moment before turning his attention back to Leyla. "Because I promised. I guess it's fine if you forget that one." Leyla made a reluctant effort to withdraw, but Matthias was adamant. "I'll teach you how to swim." His face suddenly took on a childlike smile. "Right here on the shelter river." In the light of the immense beauty of his smile, she simply couldn't bring herself to recall the words of rejection. Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 5. Leyla finally had the weekend she had been dreading. It was a weekend that came with a promise to dash her hopes against the ground and rise her fears she buried in her heart alive. Yet, Leyla von Herhardt was the first ray of hope, shining like a distant star. Leyla wanted to introduce her new family to her relatives at the tea party she was attending with Felix. Leyla would often have felt anxious about going to a social event with her mother-in-law, but this time was different. She had grown interest in such gatherings, and Leyla had excitedly encouraged her daughter-in-law to attend. Leyla was asked questions, but before she could even answer Leyla's query, Matthias had an answer, shielding her like an armor. "My dear wife and I had made prior arrangements for that day," he said in a soft, authoritative voice. Leyla von Herhardt shrugged. "Then there's nothing more to be done," adding, "but Felix must come with me, Everyone is eager to see him. Matthias complied with her request and said, "Of course, mother, you may do as you wish." In this finalized plan, Leyla's hopes dissipated like wisps of smoke into thin air. While she felt sorry for Matthias not getting a proper break, Leyla secretly hoped that the Duke's schedule would stay as hectic as ever, even better if he returned on a particularly dark night. Matthias's demanding career reignited a glimmer of hope within her. While he was supposed to be on vacation, he continued to work, talking with executives on the phone and traveling to Karlsbad for meetings. Leyla couldn't help but wonder how many more visitors the Duke of Arvis would receive. As the afternoon resigned like a short-lived guest and Matthias failed to come home for tea, Leyla's hope only grew stronger. She couldn't help but hope that he wouldn't return. However, her fantasies evaporated, as a word from the butler brought the news about her husband. "Matthias, you're back early," Norma said, setting down the teacup and smiling warmly at her grandson. After greeting his grandmother, Matthias turned his head slightly to look at Leyla, who was seated across from him. "Right. You mentioned that you had a meeting with Leyla today," Norma reminded him, unaware of Layla's emotions. "Are you going out with someone?" "No, I decided to teach her how to swim in the annex," Matthias replied. "What? The Duchess going for a swim in the river?" Norma startled and asked, scowling at the idea. Layla's heart began to pound like 100 drums together with immense excitement at the prospect. "Oh, Matthias, my goodness. That is ridiculous," Norma said. Leyla discovered for the first time that words have the power to bring joy in one's life, even for a fraction of a moment. She thought that the elderly woman would be adamantly opposed, but to her surprise, she was kind-hearted. "Oh, that's correct. Since our time, the world has changed. The Duchess should learn to swim since it's a trendy hobby," suggested the elderly lady. Leyla tightened her grip on her skirt, fighting the urge to yell, "Excuse me, Grandma?" Yet she resisted waging war against her impulse. The elderly woman smiled softly as if consoling her anxious grandkids and said, "I don't understand it, but I won't force it on you. Enjoy yourself, Leyla." Matthias drew near as soon as Layla's last hope vanished. He calmly extended his hand, giving off the impression of a predator lurking nearby with its prey. Leyla sighed quietly while holding his hand reluctantly. It was a time when Matthias von Herhardt, who was known for always keeping his word, displayed some animosity. Isn't it time you were prepared? Matthias checked the time and questioned Leyla, who shook her shoulders and stepped up to the railing of the balcony. "Could you give me a moment to think it over?" Leyla asked, her voice barely audible due to her tense demeanor, still hoping that Matthias might change his mind. Matthias leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, displaying patience for his wife. For almost an hour, Leyla faced the river as if it were a foe that haunted her, in her dreams and in her waking. On the way to the detached house, she'd been bold and courageous, but now she seemed terrified, her bravery dripping, fading away from the creaked holes of her heart. Leyla took a deep breath by the way, and turned around. "Isn't there a reason why people must be good at swimming?" she wondered, eager. What would her husband say? Leyla kept talking on with a rather serious face. "You just have to be careful not to fall into the water, right? But don't you know if unexpected situations happen?" Matthias asked, his voice filled with concern. Layla's eyes squinted as she struggled to come up with a counter-argument. "That unforeseen circumstance was brought on by you." The angry comments poured out more forcefully like a volcano. Matthias presented a look to Leyla that didn't convey either denial or embarrassment, his face drained of emotions, cold like Antarctica. "You weren't going to forget, right?" Matthias answered, cautiously getting out of his chair. "No, I remember. I want to teach you how to swim because of that exact event." He leaned on the railing and reeked of water mint, which grew by the river. "But Leyla, I can't make you do it if you genuinely don't want to." He gave her a respectful glance as a sign that he would respect whatever choice she chose. When he claimed he would respect her decision, Leyla knew he truly meant it. It was evident in the way he regarded her, gazing deeply into her emerald green eyes, deeply like an ocean. Leyla let go of the railing and stood up, saying, "I don't know. It's not that I dislike it, though." That much was certain to her. She had the option to refuse numerous times if she truly desired to, yet she didn't want to. She wanted to learn to defy her fears. "And I'm terrified of the water." Certainly, you contributed greatly to my fear of it, but it doesn't mean you alone are to blame." Leyla stopped gazing up the river, as if attempting to block out the recollection of having caused her anxiety. Back in time, her cousins said to her, their words innocent yet terrible enough to cause hurt, "If you want to live here, you have to go through an initiation rite." The words kept ringing in her ears like a disease. "If you don't want to do it, get out of here." She was bullied. The oldest and biggest boy laughed like a devil, dragging her while grabbing her braided hair. Leyla was captured by the kids like a hyena captured by a lion to be devoured, making her plans to run away a complete failure. She got wounded, her body slathered in blood and plastered in mud from roll and fall while dodging her to the cruel edge of river. Every minute was a torture there. She was the subject of her uncle's sudden cursing and beating, and the horrible bullying of all the kids in the family. She also struggled with the torment of hunger they inflicted, which forced her to raid the garden for vegetables like a criminal in punishment. Despite all the torment she went through, Leyla couldn't bring herself to utter "I don't want to" or "I have nowhere else to go in the world, stop hurting me." The road that had to return home wailing even after being tossed into the river lodged within her heart as a token of the hopeless fear and anguish of the day. The memory stayed with her forever, living and breathing, not leaving her in peace from the past. She didn't want Matthias to learn more, therefore she accepted the swimming challenge. Early on, Leyla recognized her predicament. Compassion and sympathy from others were also appropriate. But even though he was acclaimed as the most aristocrat in this empire, she never wanted to appear unclean in his presence. Even though she knew she couldn't, she still hoped for it. From the moment he trod on the spilled penny, scooped it up, and frantically rushed away, to the present. Maybe forever and in the future. Leyla. She thought deeply about the person Matthias called. It seemed odd since, although having the same name, Matthias sounded like an entirely different person. Is it the low, gentle voice, or is it the tone that sounded like a poem that rhymed? Will everything be okay in the end? Leyla tightened her fist rather than gripping the railing once more. I am not sure if I could float in the water. The good scientist is better than anybody else at understanding that persons who float in water are not operating in the confidence-related domain. Though it was a serious query, he responded sarcastically. Leyla couldn't find appropriate words to speak, she appeared perplexed. She chose to gaze at the distant sky, wishing to disappear in the hem of sky's blue quilt. She felt like her body was floating in the wide ocean. The silence got almost deafening that she screamed, atmosphere shaking off the environment from its tranquility. I'll give it some more thought. She fought as hard as she could, but Matthias, who held her tightly in his arms, made no movement at all. He remained determined like a warrior who swore to win a war despite all odds. He walked down the stairs from the balcony to the boat hangar, which was next to the river. Leyla's fear of water exploded in her body like an atom bomb. She froze for a second before settling down as she noticed the water racing by, aiming to devour her. Matthias gave her pale cheeks a quick kiss before making a lengthier exit from the hangar. When they reached the end of the dock, the shadow of a man and a woman in his arms that had been moving across a wooden panel warmed by the sun halted. An afternoon in June. The water sparkled like diamonds, absorbing the sunlight. She felt awfully stupid, yet in actuality, it was more of a fact than an assumption. Leyla, who was perched at the end of the dock, cast a visibly dejected glance across the river. Matthias appeared to sparkle like a component of the sparkling surface as he floated along the water. He resembled like a statue God carved himself, exquisite beyond measure. Leyla gave up mustering up her bravery and Matthias gladly accepted it. He started swimming joyfully, being on his own. You can turn around. Such callous comments were all he left for Leyla. Despite the option to return, she remains where she is, a miserable fool. But upon further reflection, it seems that the man in question is also somewhat strange. Leyla's eyes narrowed as she considered this. Why would he make a promise to bring her here, only to leave her in such a vulnerable state? She wondered. Matthias, meanwhile, stood tall on the river with his back to the sky, looking stunning and free-spirited. Leyla, determined, removed her shoes with a fierce motion, and then took off her stockings. She started to feel lightheaded and shaky already as she went near to the river, her worst nightmare. Leyla yearned to recapture the reckless bravery she had displayed when she had dove into the water to retrieve her hat, but all she could do was sit at the end of the pier with her feet partially submerged. Why are you still here? Matthias, now standing on the dock, asked playfully. His wet, partially exposed body glistened in the summer sunlight, and the marks of his injuries only served to enhance his jaw-dropping beauty. You seem quite content, Leyla observed. As you can see, Matthias replied, leaning his head on one arm and looking up at her adoringly. Why did you return? "Are you trying to tease me?" she asked. "If that's what you desire," Matthias said with a teasing smile. Leyla rose up in a wrath despite the fact that she understood it wasn't such a bad joke. She, not Matthias, was the one who was going to be annoyed and disappointed. Why won't she muster the final ounce of bravery? For 3 minutes, Leyla clamped her lips together. She despised herself for being haunted by her terrible recollections of old times. She had to go through worse and more unpleasant things than that. She came from a long way of troubled times. She can't believe how unprepared she was for the water despite being accompanied by her loving husband. Leyla turned around again, blocking her escape from the river. She marched decisively to the end of the dock, this time, like a soldier prepared to slash the enemy's throat. Matthias watched her intently. Leyla began with removing her glasses, relieved to take the pressure off her eyes. Then, she began to undress, starting with her slip, then her skirt and blouse. Despite feeling embarrassed, she managed to maintain her composure, possibly thanks to her impaired vision. Leyla hesitated for a moment before finally removing her bra and underpants, tucking them beneath a pile of clothes. In the radiant light, her naked body was illuminated, brighter than the sun, like a goddess who stepped on earth. The two of them fell silent, not tempted to break it, but their eyes locked onto each other in the brightness, talking loudly with words and speech. "I'm ready," Leyla declared proudly, sitting down at the end of the dock and dipping her legs into the water once more to savor the unhealed wounds. "To be honest, I don't think it would work. But I'll do my best." Leyla wanted to cry, she wanted to finally shed the old wounds, yet she restrained herself, fighting back her tears. Matthias softly extended his hand to her while he was calmly gazing. Leyla held his hand with all her might, the hand that had lowered the wooden pillar, secretly begging to hold her forever. "You're not going to let me go, are you?" In response to the sincere query, Matthias happily nodded. "Never." Leyla put faith in his assurances. She leapt into the water, putting her last hesitation behind her, defeating her phobia, letting her memories flow along the river. She ripped apart the peace and calmness of the river with the wild sounds of splashing, careless spraying, and ear-tearing screams. Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 6. Leyla von Herhardt's swimming skills were, to put it kindly, disastrous. It seemed almost pointless to even assess her abilities. She was putting in so much effort just to stay afloat that it could hardly be considered swimming. As she stumbled, spluttered, and flailed, Leyla let out repeated screams. Yet, when Matthias pulled her close in an embrace, she calmed down, as gentle as could be, her gaze steady and full of unwavering faith. Matthias knew in that moment that he would never forget it, the moment God imprinted his eyes and in his mind forever. Leyla's attempt at swimming, if it could even be called that, finally came to an end as the sun began to bid farewell. Matthias lifted the exhausted Leyla and placed her at the end of the dock. She panted heavily, the sound of her breaths depicting the ripples of the water. Shortly after, Matthias also sat down beside her, equally spent. "It looks like the water level in the shelter river might have gone down a bit today." "I swallowed a lot of water," Leyla said with a silly smile when their eyes met. As he gazed at her face, Matthias watched the water droplets travel across the woman's body, like the magnificent drops of rain. The water altered the color of her hair and cheeks, making her skin appear even paler in comparison. At the top of her chest, where it rose and fell sharply with each breath, drops of water formed and flowed down her slender collarbone like the water finally found its stream to be united with. The natural hue of her skin seemed even clearer now, like a crystal. Slowly but surely, the droplets fell to the ground and disappeared between her legs, without saying a goodbye. Matthias succeeded to bring back her joyous expression. Leyla found herself caught in an odd tension and held her breath, even though there was no hint of desire in his guarded gaze. It was almost comical. She hadn't gone swimming naked in quite some time, but all of a sudden she felt like it. After all, he was also the father of the child she had given birth to. They had been sharing a bed and waking up together every morning for nearly a year now. "Can you smile even when something is unpleasant?" Leyla pushed back her wet hair, revealing her bare chest, beautiful like a starlit sky. "I'm going to look ridiculous," she said. The strength in her tightly pressed together knees was almost reflexive. Matthias tilted his head and looked down at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. However, given how mortifying the situation was, it seemed that the matter was no laughing matter. Leyla searched for the clothes she had removed, playing with the strand of hair that was twisted around her finger. But instead of finding her garments, she discovered a basket filled with neatly arranged dresses and towels. When she realized someone had arrived, Leyla looked embarrassed. Matthias, on the other hand, was dressed casually. Leyla veiled her naked body with a gown. The gentle touch brought back memories of how he had been staring at her body earlier, and Leyla became more puzzled as she tried to push these thoughts out of her mind, and the sensations became more intense, birthing wild desires in her. "Should we try again?" Leyla impulsively suggested. The river was suddenly bathed in a deep, crimson light, which was both beautiful and unsettling. Leyla was ready to embrace the allure fully. "I feel comfortable floating in the water now. So if I pick up a little more knowledge?" Matthias responded unexpectedly, untying Layla's gown's thread, and saying, slowly, "Leyla." In the breeze from the river, the orderly knot shuddered and flapped. "The summer is lengthy." The large hand that cupped her chin was gentle and cold. The downward gaze that accompanied it was equally soft. Layla's lower eyes were slightly hazy as she saw the shadow of his long eyelashes there. He was already just a few inches away from her nose. Without thinking, her lips parted as the grip on her chin became firmer, welcoming him to kiss her. "You can do it slowly." Matthias' voice grew softer and lower as he added a hint of warmth to it. Leyla nodded in agreement. She now knew the source of this tension. She was certain that next time, she would be able to guess it. Matthias, however, simply fixed his gaze on her intensely, as if he was measuring something to engineer an innovation. His enigmatic demeanor only piqued Layla's curiosity further. He did not hesitate. She could at least be sure of that. Perhaps that concept didn't apply to this man's life. Leyla knew this better than anyone, especially when it came to herself. Yes, but why? Leyla accidentally closed her toes in the river, causing the surface to ripple with just a slight movement. After brushing her lips for a while, Matthias let her go lightly and in vain. He chuckled and cocked his head slightly to the side, as if he was unsure of something. It surprised Leyla. It was another instance where her scientific decision, based on experience, was once again compromised. Middle. The Duchess served dinner at a table set up on the annex's balcony, which overlooked the Shelter River. It was unclear who had prepared the meal, but the steam was still rising from the hot dishes. Leyla glanced at Matthias in surprise, as she had assumed they would change their clothes and return to the mansion. But the man who would have given all of these orders simply stepped outside and onto the balcony, pulling out a chair and gesturing towards the table with a series of natural movements, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to do by a duke. Leyla glanced at her reflection in the glass door of the cabinet. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her skirt and tidied her loosely curled hair impulsively. The broad lace collar of her blouse swayed as she started walking again. She took a seat at the table, and Matthias sat in the chair opposite her. Everything was served at once, from appetizers to sweets, giving the table a lavish appearance, depicting heaven. It seemed that the message that meals were unnecessary had been conveyed effectively. Leyla started eating deliciously, perhaps because she was so hungry. Matthias' attention was diverted from the food and glued on her face. Leyla always had little appetite, although she consistently ate. She taught him that there was a specific formula to adhere to when it came to the outward aspect of eating. Take little nibbles, chew them, and then swallow them before moving on to the next one. Continue doing this while smacking your lips and puffing your cheeks for more effect. One of his greatest joys in life is now seeing Leyla consume her meal piece by piece. Oh. Later, once Felix is an adult. Layla's face lit up with amusement as she abruptly raised her head. Matthias made genuine eye contact with her after releasing the lids on his eyes. Leyla snatched the napkin with a start, in contrast to him, who was composed. The lips that had been vigorously stroked turned crimson. "When Felix matures?" Matthias asked again, remembering Layla's interruption. Leyla didn't see him again until she took a sip of water to moisten her lips. It would be lovely to teach Felix how to swim when he grows up. Swimming? On the Shelter River, of course. All right, Matthias agreed readily. I will. Even though it wasn't difficult at all, Leyla was overjoyed as if she had achieved a great dream. But shortly after, she began to feel anxious. By the way, Matthew, will you also be teaching hunting? Maybe, Matthias gave her another pleasant response. He learned to hunt, and his father gave him a gun with his name on it. It was also a process that was acknowledged as Herhardt's successor and a tradition that had been passed down for many years. Leyla looked quite dissatisfied while nodding her head to indicate that she understood. I will carry out my responsibilities, but Felix will decide. Matthias turned back to Leyla after giving the lit candlestick and centerpiece a quick glance. The ability to read a bird's thinking or to be a great shooter. He is left with a decision. And you? Leyla asked seriously after a moment of contemplation. What is your opinion on the matter? Will there be a hunt in this forest this summer? What do you think? Matthias smiled and looked at his wife, who didn't look away from his gaze. I don't think it will happen, Leyla said with pleading eyes that were crystal clear. Why not? The Duke of Herhardt is a man who understands the hearts of birds. She is skilled at answering rudely, but she comes across as quite serious. You're the nicest gentleman in the Empire, not just in this Carlsbar. Leyla caught Matthias' attention and he eventually started laughing again. If there had been service staff around, the chuckle would have been extremely embarrassing, yet it was very comfortable and delightful nonetheless. Leyla could tell that Matthias had nothing to say other than that amusing laugh. The Arvis forest, where the Duke has returned, will be serene this summer. Love is likely another term for that peace. Dinner went on in a more informal setting. Leyla relieved the awkward tension by laughing and chatting happily. It was a beautiful moment when countless stars emerged over the setting sun and a stream of starlight flowed. Ah, look! There are fireflies. She gasped in wonder at the glowing light drifting along the riverbank. Jumping up and running in front of the railing was an action that was as joyous and carefree as a baby bird taking flight. After finishing his meal and taking a sip of icy champagne, Matthias also stood up and went to join his wife. Before she knew it, a group of fireflies that were gently floating one by one had formed like a constellation. Leyla appeared to be in a dream as she watched the light wave. Her pulse was racing as if it was the first time she had ever seen the divine view from the Shelter River in the summer. Maybe this was the first time she was with him like this, savoring the divine moments, enjoying the simplicity of life and feeling love deep in her heart. Leyla turned her head, ready to embrace the excitement, yet Matthias's blue eyes captivated her like a magical spell. His eyes were beautiful than anything else in the world, and for a moment fireflies meant no meaning before his magnificent eyes. Leyla hesitated as Matthias' hand crept closer and gently cupped her trembling cheek. Unlike in the evening when she was exhausted, he gave her bright face a careful, satisfied inspection. Leyla said, her eyebrows raised, "Why do you keep playing these kinds of jokes?" "Jokes?" he questioned in surprise. "Earlier, you were the same way." "Ah," Matthias chuckled as he gave her chin-jut hand a squeeze. "Leyla, if you get tired too soon, it's not very enjoyable." "What do you mean?" Leyla would hold her breath as she occasionally remembered the night when this man had become extremely aggressive. She had screamed and moaned loudly at that point before losing consciousness. It wasn't something that could be controlled by will, but she knew that Matthias didn't particularly enjoy it. "I feel like you've had enough sleep." With his other hand, Matthias expertly removed her hairpin. "Do you not?" While grinning, Matthias held her thick curly hair. Leyla's body skyrocketed, causing her respiration to become shallow, troubling her breath. She could see his eyes by simply slowly opening her closed ones. It's as if she flicked a switch and he became someone entirely different. The thought that she would be the only person in the world to recognize this man's face warmed Leyla's breath as well. "Yes. Your thoughtfulness allowed me to get adequate rest and eat healthily." Leyla didn't panic like she usually did. She addressed him with a rather open demeanor. She was undoubtedly walking on a hard surface, and her toes kept reminding her of the ripples feel, yet she didn't care. "So I'll give it to you in exchange." Leyla tentatively stuck out his hand and covered her lovely face. The toe-tingling current now appeared to have sucked the entire body in. "Do whatever you want." She mustered up her confidence to speak her heart out. "I desire it." Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 7. Leyla's eyes slowly opened as she touched something soft and feathery. While she savored the soft touch, her body felt like flying against the gravity, floating like a balloon devoid of direction. The shiny night sky with its exquisite spread of starlight was the first thing she found. She didn't realize she was laying on a long chair on the balcony until she turned around, looked at the table where the candles were swaying, and then at the railing beyond. Their lips came together like lost lovers as their eyes did. They gave each other a passionate kiss, their tongues entwined as desire flooded their bodies. Leyla attempted to encircle Matthias' neck with her arms, before she was briefly taken aback by the stern force of his grasp. They kept on kissing passionately, melting into each other's hot breaths, letting the moist sounds of their lips speak, as they sucked on one another. Matthias momentarily withdrew, letting her gasp for air at one time. He slowly licked the saliva that had amassed on his lips before leaning down for another passionate kiss on her. "Nghh." Leyla let out a soft moan as Matthias grabbed her chest, which was heaving with each breath. Despite the veils of clothing separating them, she felt and absorbed the heat radiating from his body like the scorching sun in extreme summer. Matthias grinned lasciviously as he started unbuttoning her blouse, and Leyla gazed at him with hazy, lust-filled eyes. Then he leaned down and kissed the spot where beads of sweat had formed between her collarbones. Her presence grew stronger as his lips moved in the path of the water droplets on her skin. Matthias threw his jacket aside with a thud on the ground, their clothes leaving their bodies one by one on the floor, in an urgent desperation. Their loud breathing could be heard along with the sound of their hot, moist bodies kissing. "It's all right," Matthias reassured her, who was gasping and twisting, several times. "You are beautiful, Leyla." He was doing something foolish and disorderly to her, that made her irritated by his calm voice, yet she was also relieved by his complimentary remarks that sounded true. Every time she nodded, her body began to unwind. It uncovered itself to experience lust and desire, and Matthias was clearly attempting to reassure her. Leyla was relieved to see Matthias's blue eyes sparkling and his crimson lips smiling at her when it was time to glance at him once more, as if he could see into her, penetrate through her soul. Her eyes breathed shame. Leyla avoided making eye contact with him and stared up at the starry night sky when she heard Matthias take off his belt. Soon after, his shadow was engulfed in her body that was drenched in sweat and passion to melt in his desire. No longer relaxed, her breathing was now accompanied by a faint moan. Her petite body trembled. But Leyla was fully aware that he was the one who ultimately gave in. She gets the most satisfaction being dominated by his strong body. She loved to be obeyed by the outburst of his passionate desire. She was willing to follow his lead, her body yielded. "Leyla." Matthias kept reciting her name. The word escaped through the sound of his deep breaths, sweetening the tip of his tongue like honey extracted from its comb. Leyla strained to somehow bring her hazy eyes into focus every time she heard her name fly from his lips, as he looked more attractive than before, like a lord of beauty and magnificence. Looking at her, Matthias hunched over in a sweet defeat. He went wild for her. The torrent of kisses was fierce and impatient, as if attempting to shift the blame for this insane yearning. His trembling movement continued until at that precise time, Leyla pushed him away and hugged him back, accompanied by moans and groans that she didn't want anyone to think belonged to hers. Once more, she experienced the sensation of being submerged in a wide river that was so deep that she was unable to touch the bottom. Her recollection of a terrifying memory returned to tease her. Yet her fear of the water had subsided. The instant she started to choke and float away was the same. When Leyla opened her eyes, she noticed him. He was right there, in front of her, erected. She turned to face the noble aristocrat, whose intimidating intensity of stare and firm resolve persisted. This man, who once hailed as a masterpiece of the Herhardt family, had evolved into someone driven by animalistic cravings, however, brought her greater joy at this point. Leyla secretly reveled in the notion that she was the only person to have this knowledge of him, and that, at this very time, he belonged to her. Completely. And entirely. N-G-H-H. Matthias' brows narrowed as Leyla jokingly called him Matthew for the first time. The morning following their wedding, this was the first time Leyla had referred to him in that way. He noticed her face filled with a mixture of delight and trepidation when he opened his eyes to the sunlight. "What do you think of that moniker, Matthew?" As she lay in his arms, Leyla asked the question in a cheerful, singing voice. Matthias, who finally understood the meaning of the nickname, smiled. He had told her several times to call him by his name, but she had stubbornly refused and finally decided to give him a new name. Matthew. He was her Matthew. Matthew that entirely belonged her along with the name. Matthias had heard such nicknames during his childhood, but no one had ever called Duke von Herhardt by such a shy nickname since he inherited his title. Not even his grandmother or mother had done so. He now found it hard to accept that she gave him a nickname like this. He would have rejected the term right away if it had been suggested by someone else, but Leyla's voice made him enjoy hearing it. It was pretty tempting for him to imagine that only Leyla would ever refer to him by this name for the rest of his life. "Tell me if you don't like it," she said afterward. "I'll just address you by your name, like you requested. But I prefer this name more," Leyla added as she gave him a warm glance. He predicted that she would continue acting in this way. He finally grinned and gave in, and from that point forward, he became Leyla's Matthew. "Matthew, do you know what?" Leyla's tiny hand, which was gripping his shoulder, quickly stroked Matthias' cheek. "You are mine as well." Leyla remarked this while grinning naively like a young child. Matthias started laughing ferociously as he peered down at her foggy face to understand what she was saying. He was laughing, but it was somber laughter, accompanied with breath-holding. Leyla was the only word he managed to articulate, voice so gruff it was nearly a growl. As her fingers brushed his cheek, Matthias couldn't help but squeeze her fiercely. He desired to stomp on her. He wanted to devour her whole and bite her. Yet Matthias was only able to give her a lengthy kiss on her thin, rapidly throbbing wrist. "Yes, I'm yours," Matthias delivered a dry whisper while nodding. His shirt collar was gently absorbing sweat as it quietly dripped down his neck. "Indeed, Leyla. I'm yours." There was nothing left in Matthias's quiet eyes as he sat up and stared at Leyla, except an uncontrollable desire that he didn't know how to deal with. It was a summer night, with the starlight seeming to cover the sky, the river, and the forest connecting them. The disturbance that had shaken the clear, transparent silence of the night died down as the fireflies stopped their group dance. The sobs and murky moans mixed together as if in pain, and the silence that followed deepened as the night went on. Before removing his face from Layla's neck, Matthias barely managed to control his rapid breathing. Layla's eyes were closed, but she was still breathing vigorously. She started to get a cold as her body cooled down, and her shoulders started to tremble. She was in his arms as he dozed off while licking the tears from her eyes. He then extended his arm and grabbed his jacket that had been left on the ground. He made a gentle move of covering her with the jacket, in stark contrast to when he had pushed her mercilessly before. After a long time, Leyla barely opened her eyes and looked up at Matthias. Instead of seeing the starlit sky and dangling stars, she saw the blue snow of his eyes. Matthias was still overly dressed, except for a loosely tied tie, a wrinkled shirt, and a few open buttons. Leyla frowned at the unfairness of it, but soon laughed and made fun out of the moment. He didn't look so bad when he had lost his composure. She laid her forehead against Matthias's straight forehead and affectionately rubbed the edge of his nose before kissing it mischievously. She did this with the same languid satisfaction and affection that he had shown her. She only reciprocated his affection. With a low smile on his face, Matthias gently and lovingly massaged her Layla's head. Then he grasped her cheek tightly with his hand. Matthias took the lead and kissed her first this time. It was a more delectable, deeper, and sweeter kiss than hers. Leyla was on the verge of crying, but she restrained herself. Her heart appeared to shine brightly like crescent moon. She didn't want to spoil the moment heaven blessed her with. Middle. Late at gray night, the Duke and his wife departed from the detached home. Leyla was adamant that they return to the mansion even though it wouldn't matter if they passed out there. Matthias gladly accepted the explanation because of Felix. The two took a leisurely stroll along the nighttime crying forest path while holding hands. Leyla took many glances at Matthias by her side as she processed the new information. His cheeks lit up with memories of the times she used to stroll in the forest and leave the detached house by herself. She was often embarrassed and depressed back then, but on the occasions when Matthias gave her a little love, she felt much worse and was unable to handle it. She therefore hoped that he would prefer to be unkind, but these naive hopes would never leave her heart. If it happened, it happened. If it was trod upon, it was trod upon. She couldn't throw it away, even though it was just a scabbed wound. She often spent the night crying out of intense agony. She never considered it to be love. She never imagined she would be loved. Maybe she was feigning ignorance, yet whatever she felt with Matthias was more than love that traveled to crack holes of her heart and soul, filling her with a light she never hoped she could find. A light filled with 1,000 colors of love, hope and joy. Leyla. Matthias whispered her name when the wind sprinkled its sweet scent around them. That Leyla eventually woke up to the truth. Before they knew it, they were strolling through the mansion's rose garden. Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 8. Layla's confusion, with her usual expression, deepened as ocean as she acted beyond measure. No way had her heart beaten with careful expectations, but on the other hand, she couldn't believe it. No way. This guy, Matthias von Herhardt? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears like 1,000 drums together as she prepared to step back in case she was caught. Suddenly and unexpectedly, Matthias placed the rose on the side of her hair and tied it up. Leyla held her breath tightly as she fixed her expressionless gaze on him. The rose rustled in her hair like a thunder. It seemed more awkward and unpleasant than when their bodies were jumbled together, in some strange way. But Matthias seemed so at ease. This is what? Leyla gently probed the rose in her hair. I'm certainly not a child, she exclaimed without a pause. The young girl who used to play in the Arvis woodland while wearing a crown has grown into a mature adult. In addition, whether Leyla wanted it or not, she was now a wife and mother in addition to being the Duchess of Herhardt. "It's pretty," Matthias whispered just as Leyla was about to pull out the rose. Holding Layla's hesitating hand, he smiled as if God had made him look at his pleased creation. It was the smile of a ruler with arrogant and merciful dignity. Leyla eventually lowered her hand, leaving the rose stuck in her ears. Matthias satisfiedly gazed at her figure before loosely wrapping his hand around her chin. He then slowly lowered his head and gave a short kiss to her soft lips that were soft like a petal of roses. She realized that the feverish yearning for a sunny afternoon was still alive. No. She was aware at that very moment. She tried everything to stay blind since she couldn't accept it. Leyla was captivated again by Matthias's hand as he led her away. The marble stairs that connected the mansion and the garden were etched by the shadows of the two pedestrians wandering side by side. "However, did you know that you are losing credibility?" Leyla asked a strange inquiry as she was about halfway up the steps. In response, Matthias cocked his brow. "You can say I'm pretty readily." Layla's eyes staring at him, clear and gentle despite the way she moaned. "Therefore, it occasionally sounds deceiving." Layla's eyes explicitly stated her desire to ask Matthias to repeat it, despite Matthias' best efforts to appear innocent. "On the other hand, I'll tell you with more authority." Matthias was open to being duped by an attractive fairy who nonetheless behaved brutally. "What a lovely blossom." His accent was quite strong. "What?" Leyla frowned while paying close attention. "That seems like a lie even more. It's really odd." The way Matthias spoke was quite weird. He presented an extremely poor performance which she did not expect. As Leyla listened carefully, she wrinkled her nose at Matthias's awkward way of speaking. He looked like a really bad performer. "Wait, it's..." Layla's face hardened as she remembered something while laughing. "Don't tell me it's..." The memory of her far-flung miserable charity performance last winter, which she had been trying to forget, came back to her like an uninvited guest. Seeing the startled Leyla, Matthias began to giggle. "Why on earth do you remember such things?" Leyla chuckled. "It's such a strong memory, it's hard to forget." Matthias answered with a grinning smile. "Don't tell me." "Because I don't want to remember it," Leyla said, shifting her gaze to roses. She frequently walked with a straight face, but Matthias simply and quickly caught up with her. "Do you not believe that I am a better performer than you were that day, Leyla? Don't say that again, please. Ignore it." Leyla shook Matthias' hand and started to go, unsure of what to do. Her deliberate steps reverberated across the mansion's quiet lobby. The sound echoed, announcing the news of her arrival. Thankfully, Matthias stopped chasing her. Leyla was instantly relieved when she heard a conversation emanating from the mansion's main gate-connected side of the hall, which was on the other side of the room. She immediately faced the well-liked protagonist. It was Arvis hostess Leyla von Herhardt who had arrived home later than expected. Leyla bolted across the hallway, startled. When Leyla noticed her approaching daughter-in-law, her eyes narrowed like those of a cat in deep sleep. Fortunately, Leyla was able to safely welcome her without making the error of disregarding protocol. Leyla and Matthias, who subsequently entered alone, soon stood side by side. Leyla watched Matthias extending a welcome to his mother, and her joy that it was not an improper civility was quickly lost. Matthias's direct gesture seemed nothing like hers. He was so graceful and kind as he turned to face his mother with a straight neck that she had trouble remembering the man who had pushed her with overt longing and pulled naughty childish pranks on her. "I notice that both of you are running late for home." Leyla von Herhardt's eyes finally showed satisfaction at that point. Today's meeting was really productive, thanks to Felix. Her lips released a brief sigh after continuing to speak in a lower tone. She was staring at the pale pink rose that was trapped in Layla's messy side hair. Leyla blinked in bewilderment, blushed afterward, and grasped for her hair. "Just plain scared. Such a ladylike manners and tone." Leyla reprimanded her severely before giving her a hearty laugh. "Felix. Your mum also looks to be in a great mood today," Leyla sighed as she looked across at her sleeping grandson in the nanny's arms to end the conversation. Leyla looked at Matthias with tear-filled eyes as she watched Leyla walk away with the sound of her usual heels. However, the man who was responsible for everything straightened the slightly off-center rose without any trace of regret. "Pretty." Matthias, unconcerned about his mother's severe criticism, stared down at Leyla, the playfulness in his words gone. The reputation of the Duchess of Herhardt among the social aristocracy, such as his grandmother and mother, was completely unimportant to Matthias. Leyla found it difficult to comprehend this particular feature. "It's lovely, Leyla." Matthias softly lifted Layla's chin with his fingertips, perhaps disliking the way she had sprinted away. His expressionless eyes began to wrinkle into a soft smile as he stared at her. The slight smile startled Leyla, and she unintentionally held her breath. Her toes curled in reaction to the repeated sound of water clapping in her ears. Leyla quickly clutched Matthias's hand, trying to disguise her reaction. She was able to avoid the shame of being seen by others as they walked together by holding onto his hand. She climbed the steps under the light of the chandelier, Matthias by her side. The rose petals in Matthias's hand trembled as they ascended, mirroring Layla's heart. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. The rose that Matthias gave to her remained in full bloom on the Duchess's desk. Before the petals wilted, Leyla plucked one and placed it between the books on the shelf. Though it was not technically the first flower Matthias had given her, Leyla chose to consider it as such, since Matthias did not seem to remember the others and it was difficult for her to say that he had given them. However, her thoughts were far from the Duke's, who seemed to have forgotten the first time he had given her a rose. Leyla had carefully preserved the petals from the rose Matthias had recently given her, tucking them between the pages of her book as a reminder of their special moment. Leyla sat by the sunny window with a book, surrounded by rose petals. She gazed out at the rose garden below, allowing memories of the past to flood back to her. They were colorful and vibrant, just like the flowers in the garden. Summer had always been a bittersweet time for her, marked by the return of both the beautiful and terrifying Duke of her heart, as well as the summer guests of Arvis, including the woman she dreaded encountering, Lady Brandt. Leyla was surprised when the maid from Claudine's cabin suddenly came to her and told her that Lady Claudine was looking for her. She had been looking forward to finishing the laundry and preparing snacks for Kyle, but now she had to follow Claudine's orders. This made her feel frustrated, but last year Uncle Bill had become angry about this situation. As long as she was in debt to Arvis, it was inevitable that she would have to do things like this. Mrs. Mona had said. She told Bill that Leyla to bear with it even if it upset her, as she was the only one who would be in trouble if she didn't. Leyla overheard this conversation as she was returning home from the goat cage. Layla's heart sank at the thought that her Uncle Bill was in trouble. She remembered the time she was summoned by Lady Brandt, when she confided in her uncle about her distress. The possibility of being expelled from Arvis and her uncle getting into trouble both filled Leyla with dread. She resolved to endure it stoically, not wanting to cause any more problems. Claudine sat under the pergola in the Duke's rose garden, sipping tea. She seemed to have grown into a graceful and refined young woman since the last time Leyla saw her. In contrast, Leyla still looked like a child with her delicate, slender figure and radiant, healthy skin. When Claudine noticed Leyla staring at her in surprise, she gave her a warm smile. "Leyla, it's been a while. How have you been?" Leyla knew from experience that the response Claudine expected was a polite and formal one. "Yes, I've been well, miss," she replied automatically. "Leyla, you're still such a child," Claudine said with a smile, looking over Layla's form. However, Leyla could tell that there was a hint of teasing in her words. Most of her classmates had already started to grow into young women, but Leyla was feeling self-conscious about the fact that she was still so young. "Leyla, it's time for you to start acting more like a lady." Even Chef Mona, who had always been relaxed about such things, had started to express concern about Layla's development this year. Leyla realized that she was the only one of her peers who was still a child, while others had grown into women. This made her feel left out and left behind. Although Claudine Brandt had only asked her to run an errand to get roses, Leyla observed that Claudine had become skilled in flower arrangement. As she walked back to her cabin with the money she had earned, Leyla thought about Claudine and her friends, who had blossomed into beautiful and bright young women. She couldn't help but sigh as she looked down at herself. What if she never grows up and remains this way for decades? Her growth was not lost on Uncle Bill, who greeted her with a pleased expression when he saw her in her new clothes. He even compared her to a newborn baby deer, making Leyla feel a sense of pride. But as she walked through the quiet forest road, the sound of horse hooves interrupted her thoughts, and the main cause of her troubles, the Duke of her heart, appeared before her like a lightning in the sky. Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 9. The Duke saw Leyla standing there still on the road and pulled his horse over to the side. Neither he nor the Duke's companion who arrived after him were seen with their hunting weapons. Leyla forced a shrug and tightly clenched the coin in her hand she was holding, unable to shake off her fear of him. The Duke was intimidating as he had always been, though he appeared to be out for a leisurely horseback ride rather than hunting today. "Hello," greeted the blonde aristocrat, who was accompanying the Duke, with a smile. "It's been a while." The Marquis of Lindman had a cheerful and slightly higher-pitched tone. Despite his noble attitude, Leyla recognized him right once because, being the Duke's friend and cousin, he was a frequent visitor to Arvis. Leyla nodded her head in acknowledgement and then scurried off to stand beneath a tree on the side of the road. She could hear the rapid heartbeats in her chest. Seeing the Duke by coincidence on this particular day may not have been the best idea, but she was glad to see that he was with his friend and cousin, Marquis Lindman. The Duke had taken to tormenting her, relentlessly pursuing her as if she were his prey back in the day, like a lion haunting hyenas. It occurred regularly on the occasions when he happened to come across her while he was out hunting or horseback riding alone. The Duke liked it. He seemed to derive a twisted pleasure from this pursuit. It was not that the Duke was inherently a cruel person, but to Leyla's dismay, she was the only one who had witnessed this malicious side of him. Therefore, she felt trapped in a web, unable to escape and unable to confide in anyone about her plight. Leyla endured this mistreatment in silence, even though it was deeply unfair and distressing, secretly hoping the torment would over someday. She chose to keep her mouth shut, as she feared being branded a liar and expelled from Arvis if she spoke it out. "Who is it?" The query was raised by a bystander. "Ah. On this estate, I've been told, there's an orphan. Surprisingly, a gardener chose to raise her." A response came. Several more comments were said after that, but the Duke's voice was not heard. Leyla gently raised her head as the sound of horse hooves grew louder. She had been steadfastly staring at the tips of her muddy shoes. Her light green eyes, which reflected the sight of the Duke riding by, and expressed both terror and curiosity. Despite the time that had passed since she last saw him, Leyla took notice of his unchanged beauty and the new maturity that he seemed to have acquired. Soon, he would be graduating from college and fulfilling his duty as an officer in the army to honor his family. And with that thought comes the realization that he won't come back to Arvis during summer since there will be no vacation in the army. This realization caused Leyla's heart to race with a faint glimmer of hope. As she stood there, staring at the group of Dukes moving away, Leyla earnestly prayed. She hoped that the summer would come and he would not return. It was all she could do. Pray in her heart. The thought of him leaving and not coming back was a mixture of emotions for her. Deep down she felt a sadness for not seeing him again, but also a relief that the fear she had for him will not be there anymore. After the group of young men on horses had disappeared and the thick dust caused by the hooves had settled, the forest once again regained its peaceful calm. But for Leyla, the tranquility of the forest was not enough to ease the turmoil in her heart, as she continued to stand there, lost in thoughts of the Duke's uncertain future and her own feelings of hope and longing. The sun was pressing down on her with its fierce heat as she strolled back to the cabin. She found it odd that the light felt so brilliant today even though dusk was drawing near. It wasn't until around 15 days later that Leyla realized the reason for her discomfort. Her menstrual cycle had begun unexpectedly. As she awoke to an unusual and unpleasant pain, she found that the cabin was still in the transparent silence of dawn and it seemed as if Uncle Bill hadn't yet risen. As she rose from her bed, her eyes were drawn to the remaining red stain on the sheet. At first she believed it to be a dream, but upon further inspection, she found the same stains on her pajamas and underwear. The scene brought a mix of emotions for Leyla, knowing that this is what her friends had been whispering about in secret. She heard the sound of Uncle Bill's footsteps as he woke up. Torn between the relief that this is something normal and natural, and the feeling of hopelessness as she didn't know how to deal with this, Leyla quickly hung the door and locked it, hiding the stained sheet and clothes under her bed. She quickly tried to fix the situation with a handkerchief, but before she could fully take care of it, she heard a bumpy knock on the door. "Leyla, are you awake? Are you sleeping in?" Uncle Bill's voice called out. "No." Leyla answered with a scream, "I'm already awake, Uncle." "Oh, come on. Then get ready. Kyle will pick you up soon." Kyle. Leyla thought in her mind of Kyle. This added more anxiety to her already confusing emotions. She was filled with confusion as she thought about an important promise that came to mind. It was the day when all the village children had planned to go on a picnic together, and Leyla had also decided to attend a play in the theater this afternoon for the first time, something she had been looking forward to. But now, that excitement has been replaced with uncertainty and the red stains of menstruation. She quickly washed herself while Uncle Bill went out to attend to the livestock. The pain in her lower stomach had been growing increasingly more intense, but this vague situation has somewhat reduced her discomfort. As Leyla changed her clothes and began to set the breakfast table, Kyle came to the cabin. He was stunned upon hearing Layla's answer that she would not be able to join the group for the picnic. "What is wrong with you, Leyla? You wanted to see the place so badly, didn't you?" Leyla opened the bread basket clumsily. "I don't want to go anymore." The bread she cut was distorted. "I don't believe you. What's the real reason?" Kyle looked worried. "Oh. Are you feeling ill? You look like a ghost." "No, it's not." "What do you mean, no? I know everything. Even if you are unwell, you still pretend to be fine. Let me hurry up and..." "No. Stop." Leyla spun around and shrieked. She thought to use the bread she was holding to strike Kyle. "Oh, Leyla?" "Kyle, I apologize." Leyla pressed the bread against her hot cheeks. "Although it hurts somewhat, it's not too bad. I simply need to rest at home." "What's the issue? What do you think?" "If you don't want me to inform my father, I won't." Though Kyle was her closest friend and family member, she was unable to tell him her story. It was embarrassing to tell it to her friend, especially to a boy. "Please move quickly. You'll show up late." Leyla was now on the verge of crying. "Before I throw bread at you with all of my might. Middle. After Kyle left, Uncle Bill returned. He was taken aback to see Leyla, who was supposed to be going on a picnic, but he ultimately accepted her excuse that she was feeling ill. Her stomach was indeed hurting, so it was not entirely a lie. "All right then, you should rest well. Are you in a lot of pain? I can have Dr. Edmund come over." "No." Leyla interrupted firmly, not wanting to hear the same suggestion from her uncle that she had heard from Kyle. "I'll eat well, stay at home, and rest. That's all I need." Bill Remmer, who was observing Leyla as she repeated his usual request, erupted into a hearty laughter. He affectionately ruffled her hair and headed to work, leaving Leyla to rest and recover at home. Once she was alone, Leyla spent the morning ruminating over her thoughts and reflecting on the pain that felt more pronounced. She felt too shy to confide in anyone, and didn't want to owe them a favor if she could help it, but she also knew that she couldn't handle this on her own. With this realization, Leyla decided to leave the cabin. Though it was quite hot, she donned thick stockings and multiple layers of undergarments. She couldn't shake her worries and apprehensions, which made her journey to the Duke's mansion take twice as long as it usually did as she kept pausing to reflect on her decision. Upon reaching the Duke's residence, Leyla was greeted by the surprised expression of Mrs. Mona, who had just stumbled upon her in the drawing room. The other guests, who were resting after the Duke's luncheon, also focused their attention on Leyla as she hesitantly peeked through the door. "What brings you here, Leyla?" Mrs. Mona asked, surprised. After a moment of hesitation, Leyla mustered the courage to speak. "I have something to tell you." Mrs. Mona exited the hallway, looked down at Leyla, and shut the lounge door. Even so, she led Leyla to the end of the corridor and turned to face her, as if she had realized that Leyla was having trouble communicating. "Now, you seem to be okay here. Leyla, tell me. What is the issue?" "It's..." Leyla exhaled repeatedly, twisting her hands, which she had gripped tightly. "I believe I am now a lady." "Lady? Please wait, my love. You're now..." As Mrs. Mona thought about what Leyla had told her, her eyes grew wider. "Oh, my," she sighed as she observed Leyla, who was wearing attire that wasn't suitable for the current season. She mumbled, a variety of complex emotions visible on her face. "Oh my God, Leyla." Leyla was on the edge of crying from anxiety. But Mrs. Mona gave her a loving grin and a bear hug while comforting her by massaging her trembling shoulders and back. "Leyla, my dear, you have to be careful of men from now on. Do you understand?" Mrs. Mona sternly admonished Leyla, feeling humiliated and ashamed. She was an opinionated woman who had dealt with similar issues as the mother of 3 daughters. Leyla was confused and couldn't quite make sense of what Mrs. Mona was saying, but she didn't want to seek for explanation, so she just nodded in agreement. "It's something to celebrate, but I'm also worried," Mrs. Mona said with a look of pity on her face. She knew that when a beautiful flower blooms in the field, its life is likely to be hard. She couldn't bring herself to say these words to Leyla and instead, let out a deep sigh. Leyla was a very lovely young girl. She was skinny and messy when she first arrived at Arvis, but with Bill Remmer's care, she blossomed into a stunning rose as she got taller and put on weight. Even though she was still a young girl, Mrs. Mona was aware of how quickly a girl may develop into a lady. However, her life wouldn't be so bad, Mrs. Mona thought, because she had the support of someone strong like Bill Remmer. These thoughts allowed Mrs. Mona to smile again. It's a school, a village, and in any case, think of all the men around you as thieves. That's not entirely wrong either, Mrs. Mona said with a hint of bitterness in her tone, warning Leyla to be cautious of men and their intentions. When asked again, Layla's expression contorted in confusion. Kyle too? Kyle? Anyway, he'll be a man, so be careful. You'll be fine. Mrs. Mona felt a twinge of regret for the kind Dr. Edman, but she had already decided to group Kyle together with the other thieves. As the time to prepare dinner approached, Mrs. Mona left the house with Leyla, giving her a small basket. She also didn't forget to give her additional instructions on her way to the Duke's residence. By the way, Leyla, Mrs. Mona called out to Leyla as they reached the end of the road. She strode up to her and unexpectedly reached out and touched her chest. Layla's startled scream and Mrs. Mona's laughter echoed in the still afternoon air. It's a surprise. Yes, you have grown into a lovely woman, she said, her eyes filled with a compassionate warmth as she looked at Leyla, who was now blushing profusely. You'll likely require new undergarments, such as a bra. I told Mr. Remmer. No, there is no huge deal. You're welcome to accompany me when I go downtown this weekend. I'm grateful, ma'am. I sincerely appreciate it, Leyla said, expressing her gratitude by making a deep bow. As Leyla bowed, Mrs. Mona couldn't help but notice the gentle and delicate features of her eyes. She gave her a few more pats on the back before quickly heading back to the Duke's residence. Leyla turned away as soon as Mrs. Mona's back was no longer in view, her stomach still hurting, but she felt considerably better than she had that morning. She made an effort to convince herself that she could handle this, but as she moved on, she abruptly stopped again just past the mansion around the next curve. Lady Claudine Brandt and the Duke Herhardt were the source of the woman's laughing and the man's low, quiet voice that she overheard. Leyla instinctively ducked behind the wall, frustrated. She wanted to go somewhere else and hide, but the couple's footsteps were getting closer and closer to where she was hiding. Cry, even better if you beg. Side story 10. Matthias stumbled upon a discovery, as he caught sight of a small figure darting behind a wall. The orphan, raised by the gardener, had been found like a lost pet. With fluttering skirts and a mop of blonde hair, there was no mistaking the child. It was by all means her. But instead of feeling elated at the find, Matthias could only think of one thing: the child's tendency to run away and cry. It was a frustrating characteristic, but one that could not be taken as a whole but be tolerated in small doses. As the child looked up at him with wide emerald green eyes, Matthias couldn't help but feel a twinge of annoyance mixed with pity. With the scorching sun beating down on them, Claudine suggested it was time to head back. It's too hot for an evening walk, she said, her voice laced with exhaustion. Despite the wide-brimmed hat and parasol, Claudine's face was flushed with heat. Even Matthias, who was never bothered by the effects of the sun, was feeling the same. But he was willing to indulge Claudine's whims, who had requested the walk. He couldn't deny the excitement of possibly finding the elusive child, who was known for hiding in the shadiest spots. However, the thought of trudging through the sweltering heat wasn't worth the potential reward. As they made their way back to the mansion, Matthias caught a glimpse of the child, running away as usual, bundled up in winter clothes despite the scorching weather. Was it because of their first encounter? He remembered the day the little girl had appeared in the forest of Arvis, like an interesting prey. But just like a bird that quickly flew out of sight, Matthias' interest in her had remained at that level. She was just another wild bird in his forest, nothing more. With that thought, Matthias turned his attention away from the child and followed Claudine into the cool embrace of the mansion. The pleasant air enveloped them, and the heat quickly faded, beaten by the luxurious mansion. Bill Remmer was taken aback when he learned the news from the talkative Chef Mona. He couldn't find the words to express his shock, simply muttering "Oh, this is so" repeatedly while scratching the back of his neck. The thought of raising a daughter on his own, as a widower, was a daunting task unlike any he had faced before. "Oh, so that child is already." Chef Mona, observing him with a hint of amusement, chided him. "What do you mean already? It's way later than my daughter," she said with a click of her tongue. "I understand it's not easy for a wooden stone like you to raise a daughter that suddenly appeared." But Bill was quick to correct her. "What daughter? I just wanted to." "Don't say such nonsense," Chef Mona interrupted him firmly, pointing towards the Duke's rose garden. "Pick up the roses over there." Bill's face contorted with confusion. "What are you planning to do with those But before he could finish his sentence, Chef Mona interrupted, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Oh, my dear Bill. You truly are a flower-growing expert, but you seem to be lacking in the art of gift-giving." "Gift?" Bill repeated, his brow furrowed in embarrassment. He had never thought of giving flowers as a gift before. Chef Mona continued, "When a young girl reaches a milestone in her life, it's tradition for her to receive a bouquet of flowers. And Leyla, your daughter, is about to reach one of those milestones." Bill's face contorted sharply with guilt. "You're right, even though she's not my real daughter, I still have to give her a gift, but I haven't found the right time yet. Oh, my. I should have sent it as soon as possible, but it turned out like this." Chef Mona shrugged. "Why don't you give it to her now? But she will go somewhere, isn't she? What can I do? Mr. Remmer can't think of her as a daughter, and if Leyla has no place to go, he has no choice but to send her to an orphanage or something. Well, should I find a gift for you if you can't do it with your hands? By the way, the idea that you would send a girl to a place where she would be unprotected saddens me greatly. This is how the world has to be." As Bill Remmer's eyelids twitched, the chef's tone grew even more annoying. "She will be a striking beauty if she turns out to be an upstanding young lady, but if she ever meets with a rascal. Oh God." Bill's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "I'll do it. I'll raise her and pick the gift on my own, just stop talking." Chef Mona's words were like a bitter pill for Bill Remmer to swallow, her intention to help him clear but the reality of the situation weighing heavily on him. He couldn't bear the thought of Leyla being sent to a place with no one to protect her, the harshness of the world too much to bear. Bill Remmer stood before the blooming roses flushed with wide variety of colors, his mind awhirl with confusion and uncertainty. He had always tended to the flowers with care and dedication, but the thought of plucking them for a purpose as foreign to him as gift-giving was daunting. "Oh, I'm scared. People would think you're her real father." Chef Mona's hateful laughter echoed in his ears as she shook out her apron and left the garden. Bill was left alone in the silence, pacing between the flower beds, scratching his neck in agitation. It wasn't until a young worker approached him that he realized how foolish he must have looked. As the young worker approached him with concern etched on his face, Bill Remmer couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The boy's innocence was a sharp contrast to the thoughts racing through Bill's mind. He thought of Leyla, and how one day, this simple boy may very well be the one to give her flowers, to court her. The idea made Bill's blood boil. "Mr. Remmer?" The worker's voice broke through his thoughts, but Bill's fierce gaze was enough to make the boy shrink back in fear. Taking a deep breath, Bill tried to calm himself. He shook his hand dismissively, ignoring the worker, and once again began pacing through the rose garden. He reached for a flower, but each time, he pulled back, his mind consumed by the thought of Leyla and the future. Middle colon middle colon middle. Meanwhile, Leyla was running an errand for Lady Claudine Brandt, picking fresh roses from the garden to take to her drawing room. Though the task was easy enough, it broke Layla's heart to see the remaining flowers, the ones that Uncle Bill had tended to with so much care and love, discarded and left to wither away. Tricky and troublesome was how Uncle Bill described the rose garden, but Leyla knew that he held a deep reverence for the flowers. The garden workers had also shared this sentiment, saying that Uncle Bill believed roses were just like people, that they thrived when they were loved sincerely. As expected, Lady Claudine had left behind many roses after her visit. Leyla couldn't help but stare at them longingly, and impulsively asked the maid who had come to deliver the labor fee, "Those flowers, may I take them?" "Roses? I was just going to throw them away, so take them as you please," the maid responded nonchalantly before following her mistress' footsteps. Left alone, Leyla hesitantly approached the table, carefully arranging the bouquet in her arms. Holding the bundle of fragrant roses felt strange and unfamiliar, but also comforting in a way she couldn't quite explain. The cabin's yard was filled with rose bushes because it was a gardener's home. Leyla was welcome to as many as she desired. She occasionally sliced the rose into pieces to use as table and desk decor. She used dried petals to create a fragrance bag. Uncle Bill didn't stop Leyla from spreading it all around the home despite admitting it was bothersome. She remembered an arrangement of flowers that her friends used to boast about, and that was why a plain rose feels so fresh to her. Leyla left the Duke's home while pondering many things. The rose looked lovelier in the sunlight. Leyla made the decision to treat the bouquet she was holding as a present. Anyway, believing that it was a present from Uncle Bill didn't seem to be particularly inaccurate. Leyla took a lighter stride as she moved along the forest trail. Along the leaping stairs, the hair that had been waved loose to make a thread to tie the bouquet was. She was unaware of how fortunate she was that the painful job and discomfort was no longer present. Nevertheless, she claimed that going forward, she would go through it every month. Even though Chef Mona's new underwear was uncomfortable, it was considerably more tolerable than that. Being a woman, Chef Mona had said the words that were Bermuda Triangles like mystery to Leyla, shrouded in uncertainty and prickling with a sense of foreboding. She couldn't quite grasp the full meaning of it yet, but the memory of the word alone sent a shiver down her spine. To Leyla, the idea of becoming a woman held a sense of awe and reverence. That woman. That's what her relatives had called her mother, with all sorts of derogatory modifiers attached. Her daughter. They called her that name with disdain, their anger clear in their tone. It was easy to see how much contempt they held for her. Was her mother truly the terrible woman they made her out to be? Leyla had been grappling with this question more and more, but finding an answer proved difficult. But one thing was certain, Leyla never wanted to be like the woman they spoke of, or like her mother, or like her daughter. It was a small, bloody lump that caught her eye, diverting her thoughts from her contemplation. Leyla didn't have to get closer to know what it was. A beautiful little bird, shot by the Duke. She recoiled in horror, biting back the scream that threatened to escape her lips. Leyla nervously walked the winding path through the forest, her heart pounding with fear. It was not the day of the hunting party, and yet she knew that the Duke had a habit of going out alone to practice his marksmanship on the small birds of the forest. Uncle Bill praised the Duke's improved shooting skills day by day, but Leyla could not shake the feeling of dread that overcame her whenever she thought of him alone in the woods with a gun in his hand. The Duke became a completely different person when he was not surrounded by the other nobles. Whenever he went hunting alone, it was bad news for both the forest's small birds and her. She debated turning around and going the other way, but her curiosity got the better of her. As she walked, the sound of gunfire echoed through the trees, and Leyla knew that the Duke was nearby. When she drew closer, she could see the Duke on the road, his horse's head turned in her direction. He had just lowered his gun, and a small bird lay bloodied at his feet. Leyla froze, hugging a bunch of roses close to her chest as the Duke's eyes met hers. She could see the change in his expression, from one of satisfaction to one of malice. She wanted to run, but her legs would not move. She wanted other nobles to show up and save her, but no one came no matter how long she waited. The Duke was by himself. Cry, even better if you beg. Side story 11. With lightning-quick reflexes, Matthias spotted the child sprinting away and immediately gave chase. Though it may have seemed like a simple, routine pursuit, Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play. Was she running from a traumatic memory? The thought of the child almost getting shot on their first encounter sent a chill down his spine. But as he closed in on her, he realized that her desperate escape was becoming increasingly erratic and inexplicable. Despite her fear and confusion, Matthias couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement as he closed in on the mysterious girl. The small girl's terror was evident as Matthias approached her. She continued to look at him as she was cornered, and Matthias couldn't help but notice how much her eyes resembled Arvis's summer forest at that very time. They appeared to stand out even more despite her petite and thin build. She was still a youngster, but he saw that she seemed to have matured since their first summer encounter. Did they call her Leyla? Leyla Lewellin? Intentionally driving slowly in her direction, Matthias followed her, but their gap gradually closed. The terror in her eyes increased as she turned around. Rose? Leyla looked back as Matthias suddenly spotted the flower she was holding. She tripped over a stone, fell to the ground, and let out a brief scream that shattered the peace of the forest road. As Matthias pulled up on his horse in front of the fallen child, the petals of a broken rose fluttered in the wind. He gazed at the scene for a moment before the child jumped to her feet and stepped back, her small face red and wet with tears. "Oh, hello, Duke," she said, as if giving up on any further resistance. Standing before him with her head bowed, she reminded Matthias of a deer she often encountered in the woods with her immature, slender arms and legs. As he stared at her stooped shoulders, Matthias's gaze shifted to the rose on the ground. But before he could reach it, the child had already run off and hidden behind a tree, her figure shaking. Though familiar, there was something different about her now, and Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was not as simple as it seemed. What kind of kid was she? Matthias was getting bored with this situation. It was nothing more than a minor annoyance. But he couldn't help but find it amusing to spend his time on such a pointless pursuit. He lowered his squinty eyes and examined the bouquet of roses, the scattered petals fluttering in the wind. "Hey kid, "Pick it up," he said, pointing to the bouquet at the end of his hunting gun. "It's yours." The child's green eyes, staring blankly at him, filled with tears. Matthias stared at her for a long time. The afternoon was becoming more and more tedious. That was when he decided to end this game. He got off his horse and picked up the abandoned bouquet of roses and approached the child who was hiding behind the tree. He handed the flowers to her politely, but with a hint of haughtiness that perfectly matched the Duke of Herhardt's appearance. The child, who took the flowers without realizing it, looked confused, but Matthias paid no heed. He left the flustered child behind and turned away. As Matthias returned to the mansion, he shot several more birds, making for a decent afternoon hunt. But his encounter with Bill Remmer in the rose garden was about to take an unexpected turn. "Well, Duke," the gardener greeted him as usual, but this time he had something to say. Matthias turned to face him. "It's nothing more than... Can I take that rose?" Bill Remmer pointed to a flower bed of precious roses that the two duchesses particularly cherished, yet his tone was uncharacteristically timid. "Yes, as much as you like," Matthias replied casually. "As Mr. Remmer wishes." He turned away, leaving a moderately indifferent and generous answer. But as he took a few steps, he noticed the gardener approaching the flower bed he had just given permission to take from. "Ah, Mr. Remmer," Matthias called out, causing the man to stop in an awkward position with a start. "No," Matthias, who had been lost in thought for a moment, shook his head, erasing his previous question. He couldn't help but wonder how long the orphan in charge of the garden, Leyla, would remain in this Arvis. Matthias was suddenly filled with curiosity about the child he had encountered in the garden, but he didn't want to get involved. There was no reason for him to know the identity of a child who was just one of the numerous users of Arvis, which had now become boring to him. He left the garden and quickly forgot about the kid. The following year, Duke Herhardt returned to Arvis as usual, but he never again went on a hunt to chase away the orphan living in the forest. And the next year, Matthias was commissioned as an officer through the Royal Military Academy, following in the family tradition. While serving on the overseas front, he never returned to his fief, and the child, who meant nothing to him, disappeared from his life as if she had vanished into thin air. There was no place for such meaningless memories in the life of the perfect Duke of Herhardt. It really was. Until the summer after returning from the front, as he stood on the Platanus Road where the lush greenery stretched out before him. A beautiful wave of green. Her eyes were as striking as ever, reminding him of the summer forest of Arvis. Middle. Leyla carefully dug a hole and placed the rose in it. It was the same rose she had found last summer, paired with a beautiful water bird that she had decorated with colored thread. She laid the bouquet of roses next to the bloody, cold bird before covering it up with soil. She hesitated for a moment, but ultimately decided to bury it. She never would have imagined that the Duke would pick up a bouquet of flowers, let alone be as polite as he was. He was just like the Duke Herhardt that everyone knew, dignified and reserved. The thought of him doing something so out of character was strange and surreal. It was the first time she felt like she truly met the Duke of Herhardt, the man who was praised by the people of Arvis. Leyla held her breath in fear that he might bully her in some other way, but nothing more happened. He handed her the roses, turned and left. It wasn't until he was gone that she realized she was relieved. She felt embarrassed at the thought that the roses might have been a gift from Claudine, someone who had thrown them away. But as she walked back to her cabin with the bouquet she couldn't bring herself to throw away, the journey felt much longer than usual. It was something she shouldn't have kept. Leyla made such a strong commitment as she set out with gloves and shovels to bury the birds the Duke had murdered. She then returned to the space and picked up the flower she had placed at the desk's end. The dead bird buried the rose in that recollection. Leyla then returned to the cabin while running. "I hope the Duke hate hunting." She repeated the fruitless prayers over and over again on her way back. "You've traveled through the woodland again today, huh?" Just as Leyla was about to enter the front door, a booming voice startled her, causing her to turn her head. Uncle Bill was squatting on the porch and was watching Leyla. "You're still a child, you know, an infant." His voice was low, but the tone was actually extremely cordial. Leyla quickly moved toward him after setting down her gloves and shovel. Leyla, who frequently attempted to occupy the chair next to Uncle Bill, was deterred by a bouquet of flowers that had been placed there. "Uncle?" Leyla asked, as she noticed the bouquet in Uncle Bill's hands. He hesitated for a moment before answering, "Well, it's like that. It's for you, keep it." Layla's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? Really? Is it a present for me? Gift? I've only picked what's grown all over the world, Uncle Bill said casually, but Leyla was already thrilled and couldn't contain her excitement. She hugged the bouquet, which was almost as big as her body, and paced around the porch, admiring the flowers in the sunlight and then in the shade. She couldn't stop smiling. Uncle Bill couldn't help but burst out laughing, forgetting the embarrassment he had felt earlier. He thought it was just a small gesture, but seeing the child's happiness made it all worth it. But, Uncle, this is a precious rose that the Duchess likes. Is it okay for me to take it? Leyla asked, holding the rose tightly and her face filled with concern. Uncle Bill, taken aback, blurted out, "Geez. A child like you worries about everything." Still, Leyla said, "Don't worry, I won't get in trouble for picking a few roses." Really? Leyla asked, her eyes shining with hope. Do you think I would lie to you? Uncle Bill replied with a chuckle. Leyla shook her head and hugged the bouquet even tighter. Thank you, Uncle. It's so pretty. She smiled broadly, holding back her tears. She thought she could finally forget the memory of the rose buried with the bird. Having a real present for Leyla Lewellin, something this big and beautiful. Leyla lowered her head over the bouquet of roses and breathed in the sweet scent for a long time. In the meantime, the tears in her eyes and nostrils gradually calmed down. She didn't know what it meant to be a woman yet, but there was no vague fear now. She felt like everything was going to be fine, in a rosy and sweet way, like Uncle Bill's blessing. The two stayed on the porch that day longer than usual. Uncle Bill continued to give Leyla affectionate head pats, which Leyla didn't give any thought to. She burst out laughing, relishing the hard treatment that put her at ease. She didn't understand the roses her uncle had given her didn't have thorns until that evening. She discovered the stem was smooth and devoid of any little thorns as she unwrapped the newspaper and rope that had been used to wrap the bouquet before placing it in a vase. The roses were identical throughout. The summer's lengthening ended. After the Duke left Arvis, the forest was once again peaceful. Leyla also developed swiftly in the wilderness, as if she had finally let go of something. She transformed from a girl into a lady at this very moment, as Chef Mona had said, the magic of the years. Such calm days continued up until the summer, when the Duke came back. Middle. Leyla glanced at the bookcase covered in flowers, and she suddenly had vivid memories of those times. The rose that Uncle Bill had given her withered and was lost over time, but the memory was as fresh as ever. Lovely days infused with genuine love. Leyla was aware that the rose Matthias had given her would eventually wilt and vanish, but the memory would live on in her heart and mind always. The lovely rose of the night that had been delicately tucked into her ears, not the broken bouquet that had to be buried with the bird. Leyla gently grinned as she descended from the window frame and shut her somewhat warm eyes. Then she heard a knock on the door. A maid who worked for Norma and Elise was standing beyond the open door. The maid gave the message in a calm voice and with good politeness. "My lady, the duchesses are looking for you. Come along with me." Cry, even better if you beg. Side Story 12. The tea party with the Herhardt family's three regal duchesses was in full swing, the atmosphere crackling with a moderate calmness tinged with awkwardness. As conversation hit a lull, the soothing splash of the fountain and the melodic chirping of birds filled the air, providing a serene background to the delicate dance of teacups and saucers, aiding a little to conceal the awkwardness for a little while. Leyla gingerly placed her cup on the table, trying to imitate the graceful movements of the two elder duchesses, her heart stuffed with suffocation of royalty while avoiding the intoxicated gaze of Elise von Herhardt. "You are truly a duchess now," Norma said with a warm smile, catching Leyla's eye. To everyone's surprise, even Elise von Herhardt nodded in agreement, casting the web of unpredictability. "Indeed, Leyla is becoming quite the elegant lady. She never fails to impress me," she said with a faint trace of admiration. Leyla couldn't help but beam with pride, her face aglow with happiness like a glass greenhouse being filled with sunlight, while her eyes remained cool and composed, the epitome of poise and grace. The lush vibrant roses were beaming through the vases on the table. Elise von Herhardt's gaze flitted to the roses adorning their table as she turned to Leyla and asked, "Isn't that right, Leyla?" The question caused Leyla to flush and fidget like a nervous child, getting flooded with anxiety. She took a warm sip of tea, trying to compose herself and to distract herself from sharp gazes. Leyla was not the daughter-in-law she had hoped for, as Elise had to admit that. She attempted to mold Leyla into a proper noble woman, yet her efforts had gone in vain. But she couldn't let her disappointment show, not when it came to protecting her family and her own dignity. Deep down, Elise wondered with a heartache if Leyla would ever meet her expectations, but the presence of her son, Matthias, made things no different than before. It was amusing to see Leyla struggle, especially when the biggest obstacle in her transformation was Matthias himself, who seemed content to keep the traces of Arvis' child in her, even after she had become his wife. Leyla, you've earned the recognition of even the discerning Elise. You must be working very hard, Norma interjected, her words skillfully changing the mood as she gave a subtle wink to the waiting maid. The maid returned hurriedly with a box package and handed it to Leyla. The box took Leyla by the uninvited surprise. This is. She looked at the two mistresses with widened, doe eyes. Open it. It's a gift from us, Elise von Herhardt said, her voice soft and gentle. Leyla hesitated before carefully untying the ribbon and opening the lid. Inside, she found a glass frame wrapped in thin paper. As the paper was lifted, she froze like the earth underneath her feet became an iceberg. The frame contained a photograph taken by the Arvis family, and among the many people in the picture, Leyla spotted her beloved father, Bill Remmer, standing stoutly on the far left, looking profusely peeved after being dragged into the photograph. I found a nice place to put pictures of you and Felix, Norma said, her eyes becoming increasingly gentle as she looked at Leyla, whose words stuck in her throat and the tears welled in her eyes. It's a picture that records the history of the family, but it's the only picture left of Bill Remmer. He really hated taking pictures, Norma said as she remembered stumbling across the picture that had been sitting in the bottom compartment of the cabinet, collecting dust. But really, is it okay for me to have this? Leyla asked, her voice unsteady as the frame trembled in her shaky hands. Elise von Herhardt, who had been watching amusedly, laughed. Yes, I will give it to you. Even if you come to possess it, it's our family's history. Thank you so much, Leyla said, her nose turning red as she bowed her head in gratitude. Thank you so very much. I must say, it's very precious. Thank you very much, she repeated, her voice unsteady as she struggled to mask her overwhelming feelings. In every way possible, Leyla did not seem to have the dignity of a duchess, but Elise decided not to point that out, at least not yet. Leyla had calmed down before she began to cry. She pressed her eyelids tightly with her fingers, took off her glasses and smiled brightly as she gingerly put them back on again. She may have been an unsatisfactory daughter-in-law who did not meet the expectations of royalty, but it wasn't all that bad, as Elise shared the same sentiments. She may have lacked a little in dignity, but she was a brutally honest child, and when Elise saw her smiling face and realized it looked just like Felix, her tolerance for her widened just a little like a glitters of light through a cracked door. Leyla, it's time you need to learn some royal manners, Elise said, her voice stern yet hushed, like the sound of the fountain. Leyla's head shot up in surprise. It wasn't expected at all. You cannot call yourself a proper lady if you act so politely towards your family, Elise continued, shedding Leyla off the little pride she gained before. Family, Leyla repeated quietly, her mind racing like a wild horse with the blend of thoughts. You are now von Herhardt, so we must hold you to a higher standard, Elise added. Leyla's lips quivered once more as she processed the word family. Elise, who was studying her face, offered a dispirited smile. I find it difficult to fully understand and accept you, and I suspect that will continue in the future, Elise admitted, choosing not to sugarcoat the truth and display honesty in her demeanor as much as she could afford. Leyla nodded, understanding. You are my beloved son's wife and my little grandson's mother. I must respect that, and I do, even if I do not fully accept it. You are a member of the Herhardt family, and while you may not be the perfect duchess, you do have certain advantages. Elise calmly conveyed her true feelings to Leyla, who was not entirely satisfied but not overly bothered by the critique. It was simply the conclusion Elise had come to after observing Leyla for the past year. I still do not understand why Matthias sent you to college, but it was quite exhilarating and pleasant for the Duchess of Herhardt to triumph over the sons of the women who once spoke ill of our family. How agreeable a situation, Elise said. Yes, I'll do my best next semester too, Leyla said with a bright smile on her face, her previous apprehensive expression now gone. I look forward to it. By the way, Leyla, would you like to take advantage of anything else? Elise asked. Pardon me? Leyla replied, profoundly confused. Perhaps the great advantage of having a child like Felix. Elise said seriously. Leyla couldn't comprehend her words. Even then, she remained silent, knowing it was not her place to speak when not spoken to. Wouldn't it be so good for you to have at least another well-mannered child? Elise hinted with a gentle smile. Even as they expressed their expectations so openly, both women remained impossibly graceful. Leyla was envious of the respectable, ladylike performances, born and bred to perfection. If I'm being honest, I would love to have many children. But Matthias doesn't seem to share that sentiment. He says that one child, Felix, is enough. Leyla mustered up the courage to explain herself despite feeling flustered. Elise, observing her daughter-in-law nonchalantly, opened her fan with a cold and unfeeling gesture. What does it matter, Leyla? You're the one carrying the child. What? Leyla exclaimed, caught off guard. Men only have the choice of whether or not to participate in activities that may lead to such results. But the Duke's morning routine is simply to visit the Duchess's bedroom. Doesn't she have a choice in the matter? Norma added, with a scrutinizing gaze. Leyla was at a loss for words, feeling embarrassed and unsure of how to respond to such private and intimate topics being discussed so casually. Even if he doesn't want to, when the time comes for him to have his own child, he will fulfill his duties as a father. Isn't that right, Elise? Norma asked, glancing at her daughter-in-law. Sure, Matthias will do as you please, Elise readily agreed, her eyes briefly pausing on Leyla's flushed and reddened face. After that, the conversation soon returned to its original, tasteful orbit. It was hard to find any trace of the conversation that had only occurred a moment ago, the one that made Leyla so ashamed that she developed the growing urge to faint in front of the two hostesses who were now enthusiastically planning a party to be held in a few weeks. Between the birdsong, crystal clear and melodious against the backdrop of the fountain's steady trickle, Leyla found herself surrounded by her own thoughts amidst the quiet conversation between the two older ladies, reflecting on how similar her husband Matthias seemed to be to his grandmother and mother. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, she supposed. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. Knock, knock. It echoed through the bedroom door, gaining Matthias' attention as he looked towards it. It was soft, but then it came around a second time, a little louder. Almost as if it was an urgent matter. Upon further investigation, the knocking came, not from the main bedroom door, but rather from the connecting door, which led straight down the Duchess' bedchambers. Finally coming to action, Matthias took his time in setting down and covering his business files on the table as he tilted his head towards the closed door. With no answer, Leyla finally turned the door's knobs, finding no resistance in opening them before she peeked her head in as she grew more restless with the continued silence. Upon seeing him just staring at her, she can't help but frown in irritation. Why didn't you answer? You were quite clearly in the room. Leyla's eyes narrowed in annoyance at him when she found Matthias reclining back on a chair. Why were you knocking on the door? He rebutted in nonchalance. Matthias himself had never once knocked on the door leading to the Duchess' room, so in turn Leyla decidedly became more confident. It's rude to open the door so suddenly. She pointed out additionally. Whatever I am foremost a lady. The rambunctious laughter erupted out of Matthias, who stared at his wife who had made a fairly sly joke, gently flowed through and entangled itself with the melody of the waltz filling the Duke's bedroom. Leyla had finally crossed the line with a bright smile plastered on her face. Matthias' eyes did not leave her for a moment until she came and stopped by. You must be very busy today, too. She eventually added as she stopped right in front of him. There was a stricken tension in Leyla's eyes as she quickly alternated between looking at the documents piled up on the table and looking at Matthias. It signified that she had something to say. Yes. Tension in the room quickly turned into embarrassment when she heard his short and succinct answer. Matthias, who greatly enjoyed the amusing reactions of Leyla at this moment, revealed his inner mischief by doing his best to hold back a little smile at the end of his lip. But it's over now. He loosened his legs, rose lightly and stood face to face with his wife. Say it, Leyla. He expressed his willingness to listen, but Leyla couldn't open her mouth and began to pace in circles. For his wife, who probably needed more time, Matthias leaned comfortably against the glistening, glass window frame. Only after enough time had passed for the white muslin curtain to swell and sink several times did Leyla come through with a determined face. The posture of holding her head upright with the back of her hand was indeed quite bold. Can I really be as greedy as I want? Leyla stared at him in a slight apprehension, her tone genuinely serious. As much as you like. Matthias nodded encouragingly, he had the same composure as that of a full predator. Leyla, who gazed up at his intimidating face quietly, reflected her greed and hunger in her eyes shamelessly to him. I wish to have another child. She leaned in closely to his lips, her breath hitting his as she eyed him sultrily. Another child? Matthias worked up a brow at her, but his eyes darkened upon hearing her request. Yes. I want a baby. She reiterated, blinking up coquettishly at him. I can't help but crave for another, you see. Leyla, Matthias breathed out in a low growl, matching her intensity tenfold. Leyla paused hesitantly before uttering her words clearly, with a caring face, looking at him in a manner she knew he'd be weak against. Give it to me, she whispered against his lips, I want your seed inside me. Cry, even better if you beg. Side story 13. It was so unlike her. To be so bold about such lewd desires in front of him. Matthias couldn't help but chuckle at her newfound brazenness, but his eyes darkened with lust upon the prospect of breeding her once more. Not liking his unresponsiveness, Leyla decided to be even more aggressive, further pushing herself up against him. One child is not enough, Leyla persisted. Felix, as wonderful as he is, just looks so much like you. I want a daughter this time, someone to take after my likeness for a change. And if it doesn't happen this second time around? He teased her, both spouses circling each other like hungry vultures. If we have another son like Felix? You'd be saddled with just two more like me, Leyla, he chuckled at her. It won't, Leyla insisted, biting her lips seductively as she looked up at him through her lashes. It'll go exactly as I want it to be. I can feel it. She hummed up at him, leaning against his callous palm that came up to caress her face. And how can you be so sure of that? Won't you wish for such a thing, my duke? She pleaded haughtily at him. After all, you always get what you want. She cooed at him. Our daughter, Leah, can't you want her? She already has the name her father gave her. So, the only thing she just has to do now is be born. Leyla laid her hands still on Matthias' hands wrapped around her cheeks. His gaze, which looked deeply, was just calm, with neither affirmation nor negation. How she spoke was desperate, almost as though she were trying her very best to bargain with him. Her glistening doe eyes looked up towards him and begged profusely. Realizing that he was not at all moved by her actions or words, her face darkened and turned melancholic. Do you hate children? Leyla's deliberately sullen performance was clumsy and even more lovely, seemingly having the opposite effect to what she intended upon Matthias. Leyla, I don't care how many children I have. Looking into Leyla's eyes, full of himself, Matthias calmly conveyed his true feelings. If you think about our family, the more children, the better. And to every child born, I will fulfill my duties as a father. It's a job that has nothing to do with that judgment, whether you like it or not. But you must have completely different expectations. I may as well only be able to handle Felix. And Leyla, I'm afraid of that. Matthias reflected on his silent thoughts. The existence of another child was still giving him somewhat mixed and vague feelings. Of course, Felix was not in that category. He loved his son. He was a child who endured painful days, was born healthy, and became Leyla's hope. He was also the biggest contributor, acting as a political pawn to his mother's reluctant and strained acceptance as a duchess. Matthias knew well that there was no name but love when referring to the feeling at the moment when he saw his son smiling just like his mother with that face. Even if the love was a little different from Leyla's wish, it certainly was what it was. But, what about the other kid? Well, Matthias was hard to be sure. Would his feelings for Felix arise the same way for any other children he may have? Without such a dramatic war, separation, and reunion, Felix's may have remained in the same sense as any other achromatic name. Even so, he could quite possibly build and maintain the balance and order of the world as much as he could, and he would do the same for everyone except Leyla. His Leyla. Matthias. He cut off and buried the idea of Leyla's friendly, loving image. Can't you think of me instead of a future that's not yet clear? Leyla wrapped her slowly lowered arms around his waist. Pressing herself gently against her husband, her soft, warm lips curled into a slight smile as she teasingly reminisced her dreams. I want to spend time with you when I have a baby. They shall grow up, and be born into this world doused in comforting and warm love. It would be so like you to prefer that time spent over the baby. You couldn't do that when we had Felix. Speaking of this, Leyla felt like she's not a good mother, but at the moment, she decided not to hide this creed. Oh, and of course, I also want to happily confess that I have a baby, and be warmly congratulated. I want to proudly show off that my baby has grown this much without hiding that I'm pregnant. When morning sickness comes, I can complain that it's hard and be fussed over relentlessly, and I can beg for what I want to eat, and when time passes in the day when the baby is born, I hope the whole family will joyously greet the baby together. I won't be lonely." Her eyes suddenly dampened and turned red, and her voice began to tremble, but Leyla could still muster a tiny smile. "Give me all that time and memory. As a gift, shall we say? Is that okay?" Matthias von Herhardt was utterly defeated. Matthias admitted the fact with a long, passionate kiss. There was no other answer. He didn't seem to want to find it, either. Their deep kiss, which began while they were still standing by the window, got interrupted for a moment when the two of them finally reached the bed. She waited with a disorderly breath, but for some reason, the man in front of her showed no signs of continuing what they were doing. All he did was look down at her, her figure clearly reflected in his eyes. After staring at each other for a while, a sigh mixed with laughter escaped from his lips. This sudden change in behavior made Leyla uncertain of what had just happened. "I thought I was being used as a means to fulfill your greed," Matthias said with a frown as he lightly tilted his head. Discerning the playfulness in his soft voice, she nonchalantly smiled and sat up straight. "Yes, that's right. How does it feel to be used by me, Duke?" she playfully asked while fiddling on his shirt buttons. The once pure and innocent Leyla had now become quite adept at unraveling his clothes. Her warm fingertips quickly unbuttoned his shirt, revealing his strong chest to her gaze. "You can do as you please, Your Majesty," he replied with a cool and smooth tone while looking down at her nimble and petite hands that were diligently taking off his buttons. "I'd happily obey your orders." His words made Leyla turn her attention towards the man in front of her with a light frown. This man was the most fascinating when he wore that dubiously crooked and arrogant grin, like a rogue that was eyeing a precious treasure. "All right, I will do just what you've asked." She smiled sweetly and innocently like an untainted maiden, yet she expertly took off his shirt that was just secured by the last button. "And use you to my heart's content." She firmly pulled him onto the bed as if trying to prove her words that were filled with fierce determination. Matthias happily followed along as she took the lead, otherwise her weak frame wouldn't even be able to exert enough force to push down her large physique with such ease. She soon ran out of ideas on what to do next, and ended up hesitating for a good while. With renewed determination, she first made him sit down against a fluffy pile of cushions. She then quickly sat on his lap and hurriedly took off her own pajamas. Not wearing any underwear, her mesmerizing naked body was not long after shown in front of him. Matthias slowly moved his gaze from her naked chest to her smooth, supple legs with an arrogant smirk. His scrutinizing gaze soon went back to Leyla's pretty face that was full of embarrassment. As if she could not bear his hungry gaze any longer, she quietly gave up on trying to make him stop his blatant staring. It was undoubtedly a very embarrassing situation for her, but in the end, she didn't hate it. She couldn't even bring herself to hate it either. She slowly breathed out a small sigh and began to kiss his neck, where she could feel his faint pulse. Slowly, she continued downwards to his hard, sharp collarbone, his muscular shoulder, and finally, to the scar below his shoulder. She may have gotten used to it by now, but sometimes when she sees his scars once again, her mind effortlessly returns to the night when she first saw the violent scars that were left on his body. At that time, she was shocked to the point that she was rendered speechless and dazed for quite a while. What the hell are those? After discovering the gruesome marks from his old wounds that littered his body, she hurriedly took off all his clothes like a distressed and concerned mother and began to diligently check all the scars that had been left all over his body. When she saw the scars that had come from the battle where the harrowing news of his forthcoming death circulated wildly, she began to loudly cry and sob uncontrollably like a wounded child without even realizing it. On that day, she kissed his scars lovingly and tenderly, just like what she did tonight. Tears welled up in her eyes and soon, she couldn't stop sobbing. She knew it was a pain that could never be erased with just her kiss, but she wanted to comfort him with whatever means that she could. Deep down in her heart she realized, after repeating such actions laced with her desperate wishes, kissing his scars that had brought him pain again and again, that there was no more room left in her heart to hate and resent this man. He returned back to her side and she forgave him. Tonight was that kind of night, a special moment where they spent time together without hatred or sadness. They needed to start afresh, but this time only with their undying love for one another. Leyla ended her barrage of kisses, that were akin to a sacred ritual, by delivering a warm final kiss on his hardened, flexed arm where the remnants of a gunshot wound remained. How far they'd gone since they first took those first steps that day. She slowly raised her head and stared at Matthias to see how he would react. She liked the sound of his breath, which was as frantic as the waves of a stormy sea. She also found herself deeply enamored by his dark, soulful eyes, which shone with desires so clouded that even the most nearsighted could make them out. She stretched out her thin, pale arms and held him gingerly by the back of his neck. Their burning body heat and pounding hearts slowly merged as their bare chests touched and were held tightly against one another. "You're so beautiful." Leyla caressed him lovingly, giving him kisses and murmuring sweet nothings in his ears like he was a loved infant. A certain someone thought that those words didn't fit his current appearance at all. As he gasped for air, Matthias blinked at his wife in bewilderment. Like her spouse, she glanced back blankly and smiled brightly at him. In contrast to the woman who was actually driving him crazy, she came across as an untypically innocent pure maiden. "The first time I saw you, I was really surprised that you were so beautiful. You're so scary, but you're still so gorgeous. Don't you think that's a strange compliment to give to your husband?" "Not at all. From that day till now, those words still ring true. I've never seen anyone as pretty as you, nor have I ever seen anyone as mean or hateful as you." Leyla gave him a light-hearted peck on the lips after she made the confession. "I'm glad you're fine with such a mean man." Matthias ended up laughing as if he had just heard a funny joke, ultimately surrendering to her in the end. His wife, who looked at him carefully, tilted her head slightly as if she were about to ask him something. "Do you think this is the only thing I enjoy?" Her hands, which were noticeably warmer than usual, wrapped around his beautiful face. Leyla, who was completely redone and wore a very serious expression on her face, was incredibly alluring to him. "Well, you're driving me crazy." Matthias stared blankly at his beautiful wife as he thought. He made the executive decision not to tell her out loud he didn't even want her to know. At this moment, everything about this woman had to be his very own, and only for him. Yes. Her vision darted back and forth as she looked at Matthias, who was simply nodding his head. "I used to." Layla's face flushed like an apple tree in full bloom when his mean words triggered long-buried memories. Even if she couldn't see nor picture herself, she could still visualize her likeness ablaze with an uncontainable heat. "Don't cry, what you like is fine." In front of her pitiful appearance crying in pain, Matthias continued to calmly pacify his wife. How could he tell such a lowly joke at a moment like this? Because of his words, Leyla fiercely removed her lips in a fit of anger, but she was ultimately speechless when she saw the brazen man pointing to his face. It seemed intentional, but it was funny of him to ask. All she could do was to hit the man before her with a clenched fist. The current situation was no different than that night. While her flimsy fist seemed to do little more than pat his rock-solid shoulders and well-built chest, he casually undid his pants. Leyla, who only noticed his actions after a few minutes, flinched. Matthias, as usual, showed no qualms in revealing his desire up front. Why did she have to feel ashamed when he was the one who should be feeling embarrassed? Such inane thoughts floated aimlessly in her confused brain, but they quickly evaporated. Her rogue of a husband yanked her close to his powerful but flexible body by the neck and kissed her soft, pliant lips like he was a thirsty traveler. To get on top of her, he pushed his weight forward onto her, softly pushing her backwards. Big and strong, his arms encircled her and held her captive in his loving wand. Her eyes gazed at the air aimlessly, eventually captured his fading attention again with a sweet resignation. "Matty." For lack of anything else to say, she kept whispering his pet name over and over again. She knew he was still listening to her, albeit only half-heartedly. She was embarrassed by her quavering voice and the hot, wet moans that accompanied them, but a part of her didn't want it to keep her emotions buried. But her mind soon became swept away by the tidal surge of pleasure, and she could no longer recall even the name she had been calling out so often. The snowy world in her green eyes began to shake as a warm, fiery heat overcame her. "Cry, even better if you beg." Side story 14. His exhausted wife fell asleep in his arms after giving in to him until she was completely spent. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that her awareness was completely depleted, but semantic differences like these didn't matter. In the end, the outcome was the same. Matthias remained immobile, savoring the feel of her tender form that had gone pliant from the euphoria she had received from his warmth. As her body gradually released its warmth and cooled, she snuggled closer into his robust arms. The unconscious yearning she exhibited by seeking out his heat was surprisingly enchanting, enough to briefly satiate him and set aside his unrequited longing. Matthias tenderly planted a kiss on her delicate forehead before enveloping her in his tighter embrace. He couldn't help but fall victim to a hopeless, amorous mood, despite being married to her for a year and so. With the supple woman slumbering serenely in his arms, he was at a complete loss for what to do next. He dismissed the notion that it was an amusing sensation to experience with his wife, as she was already his, completely. From head to toe that her skin, flesh and bones belonged to him, the same as her soul and her warm breath. He was acutely aware that his carnal desires for Leyla had never been his top priority before. And he had no desire to alter that fact, even if he possibly could. Gradually, Leyla's rhythmic breaths began to fill the empty room, cutting through the silence that only grew more profound with each passing moment. Matthias gazed upon her visage with his arms still folded around her. When he stroked the soft tendrils of baby hairs on her forehead, the shadow cast by her long lashes quivered and danced in response, fluttering his soul in desire. A gentle smile tugged at Matthias's lips as he lowered his head to plant a tender kiss on the dampened corners of her eyes. The sensation of her body gently stirring in slumber provided an inexplicable sense of solace. The midsummer breeze permeated through them, through their intertwined bodies, drenched in love and desire, seamlessly melding with the comfortable warmth of the sheets that enveloped them. With a firm touch, Matthias traced the faint path of tears that traced down her face and rested on her plump, supple lips. As he lingered, he was drawn like a magnet to the gravitating heat of her steady breath. Although his stance on having another child remained unchanged, Matthias couldn't help but feel a tinge of guilt for the limited time he was able to spend caring for her while carrying their child. His inability to be there for her when she needed me most during the war meant that the only time he had seen her with Felix was all too fleeting and selfish. He was consumed by a madness so profound that the life of his own child was rendered trivial in his eyes. But the pleasure Leyla, heavy with his unborn child, brought to him, was enough to dull the sting of disillusionment and self-loathing that festered within him. If only he could relive those moments with her once again. Without the specter of pain and trauma lurking at every turn. Matthias held her slender waist, a warmth so scorching it seared through him. The memory of her once swollen belly flooded his mind, a painful reminder of the time he had lost a long time ago. How could he forget the way her tummy had stretched and expanded, filling up until she seemed ready to burst at any moment? What would it be like this time around? How large would she grow in the coming year? He couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of her, imagining her as a beautiful, bloated creature. He adored her this moment and promised to love her forever. Such a sight would have been a marvel to behold, and he couldn't help but smile at the vision. His high-speed train of thinking quickly became cluttered with random situations and inquiries, but as he felt her warmth calmly dozing in his arms, his confusion was quickly cleared. He was quick to admit that he had been incredibly conceited, dismissing his love for her as something to be immediately satisfied and resolved once he had her. His lethal obsession with her persisted even after the times when he completely believed she was entirely his, at least during the times that their bodies were intertwined. He would be able to temporarily escape the sensation of powerlessness if he could reach as far as he could, thrust as forcefully as he could, and push his body to the limit while immersing himself in his beloved Leyla's warmth. Matthias reluctantly withdrew his hand, slowly away from her bare beautiful glittering chest when she slowly opened her eyes and let out a quiet moan. Then, he carefully tightened his grasp while slowly adding a tiny amount of strength as he looked into her hazy, murky eyes that were still drowsy. Although this significantly hampered her ability to breathe, the wicked pleasure he received from adding his red handprints to her sensitive flesh made him feel warm like a scorching sun within. "It's okay, Leyla. Just rest," Matthias whispered lovingly, calming like she was a little bothered child, kissing the lovely, hard nipples of her chest. He noted her hushed, trembling voice and overt yearning while he already inside her body once more. "Liar," Leyla whispered through a soft voice. Her slender eyes narrowed as she gazed at him, yet a faint, feeble smile graced her lips. Despite her seemingly lethargic demeanor, her gaze was sharp and pure, like a pristine lake that perfectly reflected the radiance of the full moon. Matthias accepted her obligation coolly while sitting with his hips lifted. He had already settled into a comfortable position, sitting between her spread-apart knees, while she shrank and coiled up in response to the impending strain. "What a liar you are," she said smilingly. Leaving speechless, Matthias felt even more daring as he naturally smiled boldly. He, however, responded to her charge by kissing her knee for a split second. His queen gently relaxed her hard frame, accepting and falling into his unsaid submission. Matthias tightened his hold on her slender waist and gently slid inside of her. He was utterly hungry, yearning for her even became stronger every time she inhaled deeply and softly and stroked her delicate body against his. He kept pushing himself into her, his hunger grew every time when he softly pressed himself against her pale, divine body. Leyla was trembling uncontrollably, experiencing too much pleasure. Her watery eyes were searching for something as she could only sob and dramatically reach out her arms towards him. Matthias leaned down and answered her kind plea, his entire body making a lusty moan. Her insides were warm like a sun and soft as feather, much like her body, which was barely holding on after all the pleasure he had thrust inside her. And her insides constricted around his, celebrating the pleasure that triggered her body and soul together. "I love you," Matthias whispered softly between his staggered breaths, facing her sweaty face. Now he learned the strange feeling he felt at the moment when his eyes locked onto hers, their bodies, intertwined like tangled hair. Love. Despite his attempts to look away and ignore his intense feelings he was webbed in, his heart tirelessly pounded with affection for her, defying his every attempt to resist. "I am in love with you, Leyla," I confessed. The very sound of her name sent shivers down her spine, and the joy it brought to him to say these words was immeasurable. His heart overflowed with love for her, and he could say it 1,000 times and still felt the same rush of emotions. So he said it again and again. "Leyla. I am deeply in love with you. My Leyla. I love you. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. The slow-moving season of long days passed at a heartbreaking pace. The water of the shelter river gradually darkened in color as the peak of the day's heat wave passed. Even though it was still summer, the color was a sure sign that fall was on its way. Leyla accepted the passage of time with joy, even though it sometimes brought her to sadness. Felix matured, ripening alongside the season. As he grew older, he began to resemble Matthias more and more, but also a lot like Leyla. She knew it was a given, but Leyla was always pleasantly amazed and happy about it. Love grew as the season carried on, as did the child. When Leyla was able to entrust herself to the shelter river without further fear, Matthias went to Rats for a short while. The expansion of the company, he said, had him focused with work matters. She and Felix could have gone back to the capital together now that summer break had begun, but instead, Leyla chose to spend the season in Arvis with Felix until her husband returned. Both duchesses were pleased with the choice, but especially Leyla von Herhardt. Her remarkable affection for her grandson manifested itself in recent years, and just recently she persisted on proclaiming Felix the truest and most well-made masterpiece of the Herhardt family, embarrassing Leyla to some degree. "Why? Are you upset about giving up your husband's seat to your son?" Staring right at Leyla, Elise's eyes were sharp and full of intrigue as she asked. "Leyla, wouldn't it be hard to call your husband, who was so easily dazzled by a woman who used his life as a means, still a masterpiece of the family?" The belligerence in her expressionless gaze was tangible. Leyla couldn't come up with a suitable retort. "If your own son were to threaten you, you'd know how I felt," Elise said. But soon, gone was her smile, and replaced by a grim expression. "No. That won't happen. Felix can't repeat his dad's mistakes." She smiled warmly and hugged the grandson who was sitting on her lap, playing happily. "Felix, you must be the true masterpiece of the Herhardt family." Although he had no idea what such a word meant, Felix smiled and nodded enthusiastically, knowing it would make both of his grandmothers pleased. Day after day, the summer of Arvis passed without Matthias. The two duchesses became increasingly attached to their grandson as the time for goodbye approached, making it more difficult for Leyla to spend quality time alone with her son. She did, however, feel a twinge of sadness for her son, who had fit in with no trouble without showing an ounce of shyness. Leyla's lips curled into a sweet grin as she reflected on her son's bubbly personality, which she argued was nothing like her husband's. She was getting bored studying for the upcoming semester, so she was heading out for a walk. She sought Felix's company, but he was preoccupied with the gifts from his doting grandmothers. Leyla took off her wide-brimmed straw hat as she stepped into the dense, tree-lined trail. Her long, fair hair flowed as the wind blew memories of a past summer without her duke flooding her thoughts. So peaceful, just like the tranquility of the forest she was strolling through. The year Matthias headed for the front lines as an officer after receiving his commission. Arvis people were a little unfamiliar with, when summertime arrived without the stormy ceremonial of Duke Herhardt's return. Even Uncle Bill, who typically doesn't care about such things, shared these sentiments. Leyla decided to hide her smile. How long she had waited for the summer without the Duke. How happy and fortunate she was. She wanted to bury all those feelings in her heart and have a peaceful summer. She really thought it was. Leyla went on an adventurous foray through the forest. She observed the returning migrating birds, made notes on the recently discovered flowers, and picked as many wild fruits as she wanted to convert into a delicious, jammy preserve. Leyla matured much throughout the summer. The long, lean limbs that had largely shaped her physique had given way to more feminine curves. Leyla Lewellin had a number of male admirers waiting for her at the Gillis Girls' School entrance, but she was certain that she had no interest in dating at the time. It was the season when she shed her childlike appearance in favor of a more gorgeous, womanly figure. A pleasant and beautiful summer, full of happy and lovely memories. There were times, however, as today, when she halted in the midst of the woodland road. She tilted her head as she stared for a while along the peaceful lane, but she quickly forgot about it and continued on with another light step. Leyla stared unblinkingly at the path that led to the shelter river. The heel of her shoe kicked the ground softly, sending a cloud of dust wisping skyward. She held her ground for a while, before walking downstream toward the river. Should I call him? That silly notion made her beam a bit oddly. Retuning her hat, Leyla began to retrace her steps a little faster. Middle. Kyle saw the man in an unexpected place. He was accompanying his dad on a house call. He wasn't quite ready to practice medicine on his own, but he did his best to be a trustworthy assistant. Duke Herhardt's ride came to a halt in front of a hotel on Edmund Street, just opposite the medical center. The man's familiar gestures as he stepped out of the car caught Kyle's eye, when they would have gone unnoticed with any other person. "What's the matter, Kyle?" Dr. Edmund questioned as he stepped out after parking his car. "Oh, nothing. The weather is nice," Kyle answered flatly before his dad could cross the street and have a look. The summer that the Duke of Herhardt came home was also the summer that the Edmunds left Carlsbad. Nobody had compelled it, but it was obvious that it would happen eventually. The Duke's medical position was filled by a colleague of Dr. Edmund's, and they soon settled in Rats, where they opened a larger hospital. After completing his medical training, Kyle planned to join his father in running the family hospital. Thankfully, Dr. Edmund was allowed immediate entry into the hospital without additional questioning. Kyle, sighing heavily in relief, turned his gaze back to the street in search of the man he had just seen. Almost at the same time, the Duke of Herhardt turned his head. And their eyes met on the quiet road. Cry, even better if you beg. Side story 15. The two men locked eyes in a tense, silent showdown. Time seemed to stand still as they calmly sized each other up, either flinching or breaking eye contact. It was the Duke who finally made the first move, turning to Kyle and giving a subtle nod of his chin. A gesture of politeness and detachment, a reminder that he was still the same Matthias von Herhardt, Duke of Herhardt, and Kyle was still just the doctor's son he sometimes crossed paths with. Like the days when someone named Matthias von Herhardt took up no meaning in his life, Kyle returned the greeting with a respectful nod of his own. After years, the Duke hadn't changed a bit. His feelings pendulum swung between frustration and a sense of relief. Maybe it's because he can see Layla's happiness radiating off the Duke's face. Without a word, the Duke sauntered off into the hotel, his perfect aristocratic and businessman persona on full display. Kyle watched him go, his expression calm, but his mind racing like a wild stallion. It was hard to avoid anything related to them as long as he lived under the sky of this burg. He was kept up to date on the ducal pair even if he didn't try to seek it out. People persisted for a time in their interest in illegitimate children, the marriage that upended the entire empire, and the mistress who became a duchess. New rumors abounded every day, which were then followed by various types of criticism and speculation. The aristocratic society was most enthusiastic about the position, but the university setting, where the Duchess entered and the doctor's son, one of the scandal's central figures, wasn't all that different. For the past year, Kyle had been living in a state of detachment, almost quarantined, as if he was completely uninvolved in the events that were happening around him. Despite others' attempts to draw him into the drama, Kyle remained stoic, knowing that the Duke of Herhardt's influence was the reason behind their silence. But Kyle knew the truth: how the Duke was a madman when it came to his wife. The nobles of Berg quickly learned this as well, as the Duke proved it without hesitation, using any means necessary to protect his beloved Duchess. The noblemen, who understood the brutality of the Duke's methods, were too afraid to speak out against him. Yet his power was not limited to just this one thing, and the fact that everything else remained unchanged made people even more afraid of the Duke of Herhardt. After the Duke was no longer seen, Kyle headed to Edmund's hospital. His long strides determined as if he marched through the streets of Arvis with his closest friend. Despite his actions, his opinion of the Duke, Matthias von Herhardt, never wavered. He wasn't a good man, but somehow, he was still able to be a loving husband. It was a strange paradox that Kyle had come to accept and even predict. Middle. The Duke's schedule was a whirlwind of activity, with no time for rest or leisure. From a foreign ministry luncheon to a hotel meeting with businessmen, and finally, a board meeting to finalize new overseas oil investments, his schedule was jam-packed. His personal assistant, Mark Evers, followed closely behind, making sure everything ran smoothly, without a single word of complaint and with no room for a mistake. As the Duke prepared to leave Arvis, his Duchess, his beloved Leyla von Herhardt, approached him, her eyes filled with impatience. "How many days will your business take?" she asked. The Duke, lost in thought, replied simply, "About a week." Despite the tight schedule, the Duchess couldn't hide her joy at the thought of seeing her husband again sooner than expected. "I'll be waiting," she said with a smile, as the Duke leaned in for a goodbye kiss. Mark Evers knew that the Duke would accomplish everything in that 1 week, no matter the cost. And as he followed the Duke through the hotel lobby and into the banquet hall, he reminded himself that, even if the schedule was unreasonable, he had no choice but to accept it and make it work. The Duke's posture and smile were stoic, as if it was just another day at work, his courtesy and habits ingrained in him. Mark Evers deftly stepped back as they neared the banquet hall's entrance, giving the Duke the opportunity to command attention. The Duke's presence was felt even more strongly under Mark's skillful direction, and as a result, the room became silent and everyone's attention was drawn to him like a metal to magnet. In what appeared to be anticipation of the Duke's arrival, the air began to change and shift. It was well known that the Duke was quite detested. Many people were unhappy with his marriage and his vigorous economic expansion since they upended the conventional aristocratic society. The Duke was strong and in charge despite everything, and his presence was undeniable. Many powerful families lost their way and fell apart in the post-war upheaval, but Herhardt was getting richer and richer every day while embracing the new era's order. Whilst emergent businessmen kept their rivals in check and adoring the name Zora, the aristocrats wanted to rely on him to undermine the rules. Matthias slowly approached the threshold of the dinner hall after pausing for a while. Whatever it could be, the men assembled here graciously extended a warm welcome to the young proprietor of the Herhardt family. Matthias started to move through them. Middle. Mr. Edman. Doctor. As Kyle stepped onto the second floor of the hospital, a familiar voice caught his attention. He turned to see a young girl, her bright green eyes shining in the sunlight, running towards him. She was out of breath and smiling, her blonde hair braided and swaying like a flawed pendulum as she stopped in front of him. "I am not a doctor yet," Kyle replied with a gentle smile, ruffling the girl's messy hair. "Then what are you?" She tilted her head in curiosity. "I'm still a student," Kyle replied, his fingers lingering on the girl's head as memories of his childhood with Leyla flooded back to him. The soft touch of her hair, the way her eyes shone, the way she stole his heart all those years ago. "But I'll call you doctor. Because you're a doctor for me." The child spoke with determination, and Kyle couldn't help but smile in response. The girl's face lit up like the sun, her stubbornness endearing to him. "This is for you, sir." The child fumbled in her pockets and pulled out a ripe peach. "You gave me chocolate last time, and cookies. Is that why you're repaying me?" Kyle asked with a smile. "Yes." The child's answer was strong and sure. "It's a really delicious peach. Make sure you eat it," she added, as if sharing a great secret. With that, the child took off down the hallway, leaving Kyle with a peach in his hand. He watched her go, her receding figure reminding him of Leyla in her youth. Before disappearing around the corner, the child turned and waved, her bright smile lighting up the hallway like a torch against void, one last time. With a peach that the child had given him, Kyle ascended the stairs one more story. He spent the majority of the day in his study at the hospital's end of the third floor, with the exception of a brief period to assist his father. With a library of Edmund's medical literature that had been accumulated over many generations, it was the ideal location to focus on studies. Kyle stood up from the desk and walked over to the study's window. From where he was standing, he could see a little park located behind the hospital. In between looking at the peach in his fingers and a group of white pigeons ascending into the sky, Kyle lowered his sight. As a young boy, he had a plethora of things he wanted to give to Leyla, the girl he loved the most. He longed to provide her with good school supplies, books, and snacks, his heart breaking at the thought of her going without. To his relief, Leyla accepted his gifts gratefully, but she also made sure to repay him in kind. At first, Kyle couldn't help but wonder if Leyla didn't want to be in debt to him, or even if she hated him. But he soon discovered the truth. Leyla was simply trying to express her gratitude with things that were precious to her. From that day on, Kyle accepted her gifts with open arms, her offerings of colorful bird feathers, mysterious pebbles, and wild fruits all holding a special place in his heart. But of all the gifts, it was the wild fruits that he treasured the most. They were a reflection of her wild and free spirit, and every time he bit into one of her offerings, he felt like he knew her a little bit better. And the fruit, just like Leyla, were all sweet and delicious. Kyle sat by the window, staring out at the park below, savoring the taste of the juicy peach in his hand. He allowed himself to let his thoughts drift to the girl who had dominated his childhood, her bright green eyes forever etched in his mind. Their love was unfulfilled, but the memories of their childhood together were still precious to him like priceless jewels. Leyla had been his dearest friend, sister, and his lover. And those beautiful days they had shared had helped shape him into the person he was today. He closed his hand around the hard peach pit, the sweet nectar still clinging to his fingers. "Thank you, Leyla, for all the happiness you've brought me," he thought, a smile spreading across his face. With a sense of contentment, Kyle stood up, the sunlight cracking through the window, bathing him in a warm glow. He made his way to his desk, piled high with medical books, and slowly opened the bookshelf. It had become a daily ritual for him to look at the picture frame, remembering the girl who had once been a precious part of his life. As he began to study, the quiet room was filled with the sound of pages turning and Kyle's mind filled with memories of her. Middle colon middle colon middle. Leyla carefully examined the photograph once again after meticulously cleaning the frame to her satisfaction. The Duke was depicted in Bill Remmer's lone photograph. He was positioned in the middle, with the other users lining up behind him. Her eyes shifted from Uncle Bill's extreme left side and paused on the face of the young kid Duke in the center. The year before the mail wagon carried the girl was shown at the bottom of the image. He appeared to be a boy of around 17, yet oddly, his stance and demeanor were the same as they were right now. Matthias had a similar reaction to the pictures and portraits that were displayed throughout the Duke's home. Even when he was quite little. Leyla beamed a little because she found it comical. She then gave Uncle Bill another soft glance that had a hint of her smile. Leyla couldn't help but daydream about taking a trip to Lovina with Matthias during their next vacation. The two countries had once been at war, but now the border was open and relations were slowly improving. Though she knew the winter would be tough, she couldn't help but hope that next year they could make the journey. She longed to visit Siena and pay her respects at Uncle Bill's graveside, where she could imagine him resting peacefully on the beautiful beaches. Leyla's heart skipped a beat as she heard the knock on the door. She was excited for the rare opportunity to spend some alone time with her son, Felix, now that Leyla von Herhardt was going out for the afternoon. "Yes, come on in." As she made her way to the door, Felix's bright laughter was heard coming from the other side, penetrating through thick walls. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the nanny, who skillfully handed Felix over to her. Leyla couldn't help but feel her heart melt as she hugged her son, who had been so mature and well-behaved with his two grandmothers. Duchess Norma is taking a nap, and Duchess Elise is getting ready to go out. And the master is coming back this afternoon, the nanny informed her in a subtle tone. "Already?" Leyla's eyes widened in surprise, her excitement growing. She had been waiting day by day. There's still another day left to fill a week. "Yes. Mr. Evers said he had contacted Carlsbad Central Station to wait until 3 o'clock, the nanny added. Leyla's smile grew brighter like a rising moon. She was willing to forgive Matthias for not promising to come back early after several phone calls. It was a pleasure to be able to reduce the number of days that felt too long. "I'm going to take Felix on the walk." Leyla checked at her watch, a tinge of excitement in her voice. "You needn't come along," she added. "Yes, my lady. Go ahead." The nanny smiled at the Duchess's order. "Cry, even better if you beg." Side Story 16. The car that carried the Duke out of the city towards Arvis was filled with a deafening silence. Though it appeared as though the Duke was handling his packed schedule with ease, he was quietly dozing off, buried in the sheets, as if he was carrying the weight of exhaustion on his shoulders. Mark Evers, who had been pushing through the demanding schedule, also became unusually quiet, his usual chatter replaced with a contemplative lull. The fresh aroma of pine trees began to fill the air as the car slowly made its way down the secluded road leading to the fief. The rustling of leaves, signaling the start of Arvis, could also be heard. Mark Evers, lost in the tranquil beauty of the landscape, suddenly sat up straight in his seat. Almost at the same time, the driver spotted a woman walking across the street. Leyla von Herhardt, the Duchess, with her son in her arms. Mark Evers turned to wake his sleeping master, but quickly realized it was unnecessary. The Duke had already opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the window, where he saw his wife. His face was adorned with a faint smile, a sight that Mark Evers knew to be reserved for the Duchess alone. Without hesitation, Mark Evers gestured for the driver to stop the car and the Duke stepped out, leaving his jacket behind. "Thank you for your hard work," Matthias said, before adjusting his jacket and tie, making sure everything was in its place. His smooth movements, from buttoning his jacket to adjusting his cufflinks, were effortless as flowing water. "I'll see you at the mansion," Matthias said softly as he turned to leave. The moment Leyla caught sight of him, she waved her hand, and Felix, in her arms, mimicked her. Matthias laid his hands nonchalantly on his back and started to stroll towards his wife and son. The automobile continued to go away in silence. Layla's steps accelerated as the car vanished from view. She walked with the grace of a feather even while carrying Felix, who grew heavier every day. Matthias halted in his tracks. For a moment, his cerulean eyes captured a beautiful image of her walking down the path, past the flickering shadows of the lovely trees. And here she comes. She was approaching him like the sound of an endless green wave, the wind playing with her hair. The sound of laughter and joy filled the dull air as she paused her stride. Matthias, caught off guard by her sudden stop, watched as she chatted and laughed with their son before slowly put him down in the ground. "Daddy!" Felix's shout jarred the slumbering afternoon. The child broke free from her grasp and ran towards his father with arms wide open. His roomy sailor collar flapped like wings as he waddled. Matthias scooped up the young boy with a smile, marveling at how much stronger and sure-footed he had become, making it quite a distance without tripping. "Hello, Daddy." Felix grinned and waved at him, then happily hugged his father's leg. "Hello." Matthias smiled, taking a glance at his child, and picked him up. "Felix." Leyla joined in their embrace with a face beaming with happiness. Matthias reached out and took her hand. Together, the three of them began walking hand in hand along the Platanus Trail, basking in the late summer sun and each other's company. Like a shaft of sunshine breaking through the trees, Layla's voice glittered with joy as she recalled the events of the past week and the botany she learned today. "I'm so glad you came back early," she said, her eyes shining with happiness as she looked up at Matthias. Matthias turned his head and looked down at his wife standing next to him. Her gaze met his with a fiery intensity as she eagerly awaited his response. "I've been waiting for a long time," she exclaimed, her voice filled with longing. "You're going to use it as a means of desire?" Matthias teased, but Leyla was undeterred. "Yes," she responded confidently. "That's not everything, but that's true." Ears that were all crimson and hands that were all aflutter, little bit of shyness that couldn't be hid not even with a child's laughing, was actually rather endearing. The excitement bubbling within her was palpable, and Matthias couldn't help but feel swept up in it. With a bold laugh, she grabbed Matthias' hand and pulled him along the Platanus Road, exchanging silly jokes and laughter as they walked side by side, turning the once peaceful road into a hubbub. As they approached the grand, colorful gates of Arvis, Leyla paused, her expression growing serious. "I missed you," she confessed, her eyes shining with emotion. "I keep thinking of you, and the more I think about you, the more I missed you. So I've been waiting a long time." She felt a little hollow after realizing that it was much simpler than she had expected to voice her mind. "And you?" Leyla asked, even though she already knew the answer. "Did you miss me?" Like a demanding baby, all she wanted was to hear his answer. Matthias didn't need to say anything, his actions spoke louder than words as he pulled Leyla into a tender kiss. Leyla accepted his answer. She loved the sweetness and intimacy of their kiss, the way their lips brushed and their breath mingled. Not even in her wildest dreams did she think she'd be able to share this moment with this man. "Daddy, Daddy." Felix's unexpected, heartbreaking cry broke the silence. The child started whining just as their lips were about to touch again. "Dad, Dad." He was wriggling in Matthias' arms, wanting his own kiss from his father. Me too, me too." With a pout on his face, he looked at his dad and then kissed him on the cheek. "Good for you, Matthew, because your son loves you so much." Leyla looked on at the two men with a warmth in her heart. Go and show him how much you love. Felix was definitely a really smart kid given how well he grasped the meaning of that word. Laughing and filled with love, Matthias obliged, planting a kiss on his son's cheek. Felix began to laugh and chatter excitedly, as if he was happy with the love he received. Our next child will love you like Felix, Leyla declared, her eyes locked onto Matthias. I'm sure it is. I can be sure. Together, the three of them walked through the gates of Arvis, their hearts full of love, hope and excitement for the future. Middle. The Duke's family left Arvis as the cool winds of fall began to blow, signaling the end of summer. Felix, who had only been with the family for a short time, had grown significantly and surprised the staff at the Rat's mansion. Leyla, meanwhile, had been working hard to prepare for the next semester of school and had learned how to swim. She was proud of her academic progress, but was even more thrilled to be able to float in the water without fear. I want to learn backstroke next summer. One evening, as she sat on the dock watching the sunset, she expressed her desire. I want to be able to swim like you. Matthias, who was with her, only smiled in response, but Leyla felt her pride hurt a little. Fine, he said, soft like a waterbird's feather. Let's do it. I'll teach you. With just that word, Leyla felt like she was living a happy summer again. The question is, when is the right time to tell him? Leyla sent a doubtful glance Matthias' way across the table. She caught the attention of him, who had just set down his glass of water. Matthias was illuminated by a dry ray of sunlight that peeked through the new drapes and twitched his brows as if he had something to say. Are you busy today? Leyla asked, looking at Matthias' familiar face that had changed a bit, but still retained its familiar features. She gently picked up her napkin. Maybe. Then would it be hard to have dinner together? Leyla asked. Well. Matthias paused for a moment, lost in thought. He then rang for a server and waited for them to come over. Leyla held her napkin tightly as she waited for their conversation to end. Leyla, do you mind if the meal is a little late? Matthias asked the server. How late? Maybe around 9, Matthias said. All right, I'll wait, Leyla readily agreed. She considered whether it would be better to talk now, but decided it would be better to wait and make sure. After finishing his meal, Matthias quickly left for work, leaving Leyla behind. Instead of tending to the garden or reading, as she usually did, Leyla lay down on the long sofa in the drawing room and closed her eyes for a moment. But when she woke up, it was time for her to head off to school. Are you all right, my lady? The nanny asked anxiously, as she entered the room with Felix. Are you feeling unwell? No, I'm not sick, Leyla replied, giving Felix an awkward hug. But these days, you've been feeling tired and sleepy, and... The nanny's eyes grew wide with worry. Don't tell me. Can I see Dr. Feller this evening? Leyla asked shyly, patting Felix on the head. Of course, my lady. Should we call him now? The nanny's eyes were fixed on Leyla's blushing cheeks. Leyla, lost in thought for a moment, shook her head. I'll see him in the evening, after class, Leyla said. School? Oh, my lady, are you going to school? The nanny exclaimed, surprised. But Leyla simply nodded calmly, her gentle smile hiding a determined glint in her eyes. The nanny, who knew Leyla to be a stubborn duchess, knew there was no changing her mind. You're not going to ride your bike, are you? The nanny asked, noticing Leyla's silver bicycle leaning against the mansion's flower bed. Leyla laughed and shook her head. I won't ride a bike. Then, hurry up and get the car. No, I'll walk there. It'll be a nice walk, Leyla said, as she picked up her leather bag, an old birthday present from her Uncle Bill, and slung it over her shoulder. The nannies and maids were left in shock and disbelief as they tried in vain to change Leyla's mind, but to no avail. Leyla finally managed to go to school only after reassuring the girls who followed her to the entrance of the mansion. Oh. I'll tell the Duke myself after seeing Mr. Feller, Leyla exclaimed, turning around with a spring in her step. The puzzled maids' faces soon transformed into smiles, mirroring Leyla's own. Yes, my lady. They chorused in unison, basking in the autumn sun. Don't worry. We'll keep it a secret. The Duchess's determination and confidence left them in awe. They agreed to keep her secret. Cry, even better if you beg. Side story 17. The announcement of the Duchess of Herhardt's pregnancy swiftly circulated amongst the upper echelons of Karlsbar and Rats. While it's not unusual for a vibrant and fertile couple to expand their brood, the tantalizing tidbit that the expectant Duchess is currently enrolled in college set tongues wagging with fervor. A child born of such brilliance is sure to be exceptional. Leyla von Herhardt shared her viewpoint, and Norma had a similar attitude. No matter what they thought, Matthias had already decided, so there was no point in arguing with him about it. His ability to create a happy union despite the apparent drawbacks of his previous marriage was actually a credit to his tenacity. If you do choose to proceed, give it your all. During their recent phone call, Leyla mentioned something unexpected before they hung up. This means that as a member of the esteemed Herhardt family, you must not allow anyone to disregard you. Is that clear? Leyla could now distinguish the intricacies in her mother-in-tone laws despite her low voice. She saw that when it was conveying sincere feelings, it grew kinder and more deliberate. Yes, mother, Leyla exclaimed with unbridled enthusiasm, unaware of the fervor in her voice. I will give it my all. I promise to do my very best. Leyla sighed with a hint of concern, wondering if Layla's exuberance was too unladylike, but she refrained from voicing any complaints. Leyla was determined to keep her promise to her family, and she would try her hardest to do so. However, there are certain things in life that even an unwavering will cannot conquer, and morning sickness was undoubtedly one of them. As the morning sickness resurfaced, Leyla found herself succumbing to exhaustion and sought refuge on the couch, covering herself with a throw blanket. Soon, she drifted off into a deep slumber. When she eventually stirred from her sleep, she noticed the fading sunlight filtering through the curtains and the comforting presence of Matthias by her side. A radiant smile illuminated her pallid features as she realized she was cradled in his embrace. Have you had anything to eat? Matthias asked Leyla, as their eyes locked. He had asked the question with the regularity of a routine greeting ever since the beginning of her morning sickness. I managed to eat a bit today, she replied, gently touching her stomach. Matthias lifted his gaze and glanced the basket of peaches on the table. Another peach? He queried, noting that their bedroom had been perfumed with the sweet aroma of the fruit ever since Leyla became pregnant. Leyla had announced her pregnancy during the late dinner they shared one night, her eyes sparkling with uncontainable excitement and anticipation, as if she were divulging a secret surprise. Matthias had to be cautious in concealing the fact that he already knew, putting forth a concerted effort to keep his composure. As Matthias observed Leyla attempting to suppress what she wanted to divulge that morning, an inkling of apprehension stirred within him. By the evening, his intuition had been confirmed during a phone conversation with his physician, Dr. Feller. I believe my wife may be pregnant, Matthias disclosed over the phone. He requested an appointment with his physician, and as he relayed his suspicion, the doctor remained silent for a prolonged moment. Did you already have an inkling, Your Grace? The doctor inquired, his voice betraying a sense of indescribable awkwardness. The Duchess wishes to inform you of the news in person, so please maintain discretion. Understood, Matthias replied to the doctor, his voice calm but tinged with embarrassment. I'll feign ignorance. It wasn't difficult to comprehend Layla's desire for secrecy, and so Matthias took it upon himself to safeguard the information. My wife had a rough time with her first pregnancy. As the preliminaries were finished, Matthias spoke calmly about the subject at hand. His military wounds pale in comparison to the recollections of those times when he was powerless to save Leyla, who was 9 months pregnant. I hope things go smoothly this time, Matthias spoke in a soft voice that lacked its usual conviction. Although, I trust that with Dr. Feller's expertise, any worries I have will be rendered meaningless. The call drew to a close with formalities exchanged, but the weight of Matthias' request lingered in the air. Please take good care of my wife, he repeated, a note of urgency in his voice. After that, the doctor routinely visited the mansion without requesting a visit to check the Duchess's health. They trusted Dr. Feller's expertise and were comforted by the fact that Leyla and the baby were healthy, aside from the usual morning sickness. But Matthias couldn't shake off the feeling of anticipation and excitement as they headed back to the mansion that night. He knew the surprise that awaited him, yet Leyla seemed to be playing a game of cat and mouse with her words during dinner, teasing him with her hints. As the night grew longer, Matthias's expectations only grew stronger, fueling his eagerness to finally hear the words he had been waiting for. Matthias felt relieved at Layla's response, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that he should have reacted better. How does he feel? Obviously, that was the simplest thing to answer. He is happy. The miracle of life was growing inside the woman he loved. It was also Layla's fondest wish. He doubted Leyla had anything she was more excited for. They work hard at making child in actuality. And naturally, this would happen, it was predictable. It wasn't until Layla's confession after dinner that the missing piece fell into place. Matthias was struck with a mix of emotions, but Leyla's joy and excitement were contagious. "Can you give me a hug?" Leyla asked by showing her arms wide open. "Please give me a hug." Her emerald eyes sparkled brightly, filled with cautious expectations and tension. For him, hugging the attractive woman with all his strength wasn't difficult at all. Matthias gave Leyla an unexpected gift that day, a basket of luscious, juicy peaches. "I want sweet and crunchy peach. That look flawless and pretty," Leyla said seriously, staring at him who first struggled to understand the significance of her demand. But as Leyla described how crucial the sweet fruit was to satisfying her pregnancy cravings, as elusive as the wish was, Matthias was willing to grant it. Leyla's face beamed as she held a basket of peaches in her arms, which was hardly a gift. She carefully chose the best peaches for her beloved while maintaining a determined expression in her eyes. Over time, Matthias, who had been watching, started laughing. "You can have them all to yourself, Leyla." Still, Leyla's serious expression remained unchanged as she extended a peach in each hand towards Matthias. "Which one do you think is the most beautiful?" Leyla claimed, implausibly, that in Matthias's opinion, both peaches are identical. "You pick one for me." "I'm going to eat the prettiest one first." Matthias chuckled at Leyla's enthusiasm for peaches. He could see the joy in her eyes as she carefully inspected each one, trying to find the perfect one. Matthias carefully examined the basket of peaches. Finally, his eyes landed on a particularly vibrant and luscious peach on the left-hand side of the basket. He held it up to Leyla with a sense of triumph. As she gazed at the chosen peach, a mixture of emotions flickered across Leyla's face. Matthias could sense her inner turmoil, but he didn't pry. Instead, he stood by her side, offering silent support as she composed herself. Soon enough, Leyla's laughter echoed through the room, and she began to eat the peaches one by one with utmost care and reverence. Each bite seemed like a small ritual to Matthias, who remembered the sweet scent and sound of Leyla enjoying the fruit on a previous occasion. As he watched her savor the peaches, Matthias couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. He knew that their child was growing inside Leyla's belly, nourished by the same sweetness and care that she was now taking with each bite. It was a moment he would never forget. "I ate peaches, and I ate other things." Leyla spoke inaudibly, as if in a dream, and her voice was scarcely heard. In a trance-like state, Matthias continued to tenderly brush her head. "What else?" Matthias leaned in with a curious expression, his eyes fixed on her face. "A tiny chicken and an egg and a little bit of bread," she murmured, her words barely audible as she snuggled closer to him. Matthias gazed down at his wife with a furrowed brow, concern etched on his face. "Isn't that food bad for you to eat when you're not feeling well?" he asked, his voice laced with worry. Leyla's eyes widened with surprise as she looked at him. "Don't be quick to blame the servants for something I've already approved," she said firmly. "I did my research and found out that a well-formed placenta can help alleviate morning sickness. Eating a lot of eggs and meat can also be beneficial for the baby's development. The thought of consuming it during bouts of nausea doesn't sound appealing. I need to focus on my studies, and I can't afford to have this lingering pain distract me. It's better to endure a shorter but more intense period of pain than to have it drag on indefinitely." Leyla's voice was resolute as she spoke, her eyes fixed on Matthias. "Ah, so it's not just some random idea you came up with?" Matthias said teasingly. With a mischievous giggle, Leyla propped herself up on the pillows, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Well, that conclusion is sensible, isn't it?" However, the glint in her eyes faded quickly as a wave of nausea washed over her once more. The morning sickness had returned, leaving her looking pale and sickly. Matthias' gaze softened as he looked down at Leyla, who was once again lying on his lap. "Why don't you stay in bed, Leyla?" he suggested gently, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll be fine here, maybe I'll sleep here." Leyla shook her head stubbornly, snuggling closer to him. "For some reason, my morning sickness seems to worsen when I lie in bed. Maybe it's the angle or something. What sets apart a sofa from a bed? I'm not sure about that, but it just seems like that is the feeling." Leyla's words might have seemed illogical, but Matthias couldn't help but find her adorable as she spoke with a glint in her eyes. "I know it does seem a little implausible." After close inspection, Leyla scrunched up her face in displeasure at her husband's strange approach to treating nausea by eating eggs and meat while avoiding sleeping on a bed because of discomfort. "Unfortunately, I'm powerless in this situation. If morning sickness takes over, my ability to think logically goes out the window." Her voice trailed off as she admitted. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, despite having much more to express. Matthias placed a cold hand on her sweat-dampened forehead and let out a quiet exhale. "Matthew, could you read me a book?" Leyla's eyes fluttered open after a prolonged period of rest, and she addressed Matthias with a request. Her plea caused a crease to form on Matthias' forehead, accentuating the worry lines etched there. "Books?" Matthias echoed, slightly puzzled. Leyla's eyes fixated on a book laid out on the table. "Could you take a look at that book for me? I haven't completed my test yet, and it might help if you read it out loud." She gestured towards a paleontology book sitting adjacent to a basket of fresh peaches. With a grin, Matthias opened the thick tome, bearing the remnants of Leyla's fingerprints. As he began to speak, his voice resonated with a soothing quality, delving into the intricate details of ancient life's evolution. The fragrance of the peaches mingled with the gentle cadence of his voice, permeating the stillness of the night air. Leyla shut her eyes and listened intently, the occasional pang of nausea quelled by the pleasant atmosphere around her. It turned out to be a rather tranquil evening. Middle. As the winter break drew near, Leyla von Herhardt's reputation had taken a nosedive, earning her a notorious status. The Duchess, who had been held in high regard by her peers in the previous semester, was now viewed with a mixture of fear and disdain, as her visibly pregnant form made an appearance in the classroom. Yet, as Leyla stood before a poster, her swollen belly proudly displayed, her face radiated with a bright aura of contentment, undaunted by the snide remarks and sarcastic congratulations thrown her way. Her joyous smile spoke volumes about her unshakable spirit, defying the notion that she was as crazy as her husband. "You're not your average kid, are you?" Leyla von Herhardt's voice crackled over the phone as she processed the news, yet, there was a hint of pride in her voice as she praised Leyla. "You've done an outstanding job, my dear." As she bid her farewell, her tone softened, conveying a deep affection for her unconventional offspring. Leyla replayed the brief conversation in her mind, relishing the joy it had brought her. And each time she did, she felt a fluttering sensation in her stomach, as if the child within was also sharing in her happiness. "Matthew. Quick. Come here," Leyla exclaimed, sensing the tiny life within her stir. She longed for Matthias to share in the moment with her, but he remained as composed as ever. "It's moving, can't you feel it?" Leyla urged, pulling his hand to her abdomen, where the baby was kicking and squirming, almost as if it was eager to make its presence known. Matthias acquiesced to his wife's request, staying by her side as she excitedly shared the movements of their unborn child. Although it wasn't their first pregnancy, there was still a sense of wonder and joy in seeing their child come to life within her. Leyla finally released his hands once the baby settled down. He remained by her side, gazing at her lying in bed. The flickering flames of the fireplace danced across her body, casting shadows that accentuated her curve. "Let me take care of you," Matthias offered, his hand tenderly holding a towel as he approached her chest. Leyla hesitated at first but then relaxed as Matthias gently wiped her body, his touch conveying his love and care for her. Leyla's initial hesitation gave way to a rush of excitement as Matthias' towel touched her skin, sending shivers down her spine. The warmth of the towel coupled with the tender touch of her husband ignited a fire within her, causing her heartbeat to quicken with each passing moment. Matthias held back until Leyla's cheeks were flushed with desire. His gaze lingered on her body, now carrying their child, giving him a sense of pleasure unlike any before. It was a contented feeling, a sense of fulfillment that left Leyla feeling drowsy yet satisfied. As they lay in bed, intertwined and holding each other close, Leyla buried her face in the crook of his neck, relishing the comfort of his embrace. The once unfamiliar experience of sleeping in each other's arms had become a nightly ritual, bringing them closer together as they awaited the arrival of their child. Leyla's voice trailed off into the quiet darkness of the room, her worries about her changing body weighing heavily on her mind. "Soon, I'll resemble a penguin," she whispered softly, almost to herself. "Maybe I won't look pretty anymore. But can you still tell me that I'm pretty?" Her question hung in the air, seeking reassurance. Matthias's gentle lips on her forehead was comforting as he listened to her concerns. Without hesitation, he answered her unspoken plea. "I will." His voice was filled with love and tenderness as he held her close, promising to shower her with compliments as much as she needed. "I'll tell you're pretty as many times as you want to hear it, Leyla. Cry, even better if you beg." Side Story 18, End. With the arrival of spring, a new Herhardt emerged into the world. The sun shone brightly on that afternoon, casting a warm glow on the blooming buds of the flower tree. In a hushed tone and with swift steps, the hospital staff approached and shared the news. A baby has been born to the Duchess and they are preparing to introduce the newborn to you shortly. Matthias gently placed his cup down on the table and turned his head towards the door. As the formal message of congratulations from the staff came to a close, a team of medical professionals led by none other than Dr. Feller, Matthias' personal physician, entered the room. They provided updates on the health and well-being of both mother and child, and bid their congratulations before departing with beaming smiles. The VIP room, reserved exclusively for the Duke's family, was enveloped in a serene stillness. Matthias sat in contemplative silence, his gaze fixed upon the blossoming branches of the flower tree swaying outside the window. The two mistresses of Arvis sat across from him, observing his wordless demeanor with a quiet understanding. Meanwhile, Felix, who had eagerly awaited the arrival of his new sibling, had succumbed to slumber after an arduous wait. As the golden light of spring flooded into the VIP room, a gentle voice pierced the serene stillness. "Congratulations, Matthias, for now you have been blessed with the gift of 2 children," Norma whispered, her voice carrying a sense of warm familiarity that only a grandmother could impart. Arriving at the hospital straight from the company, Matthias cut an impeccable figure, the very epitome of a Duke Herhardt. His expression and demeanor were equally unblemished, leaving little indication that he was a man consumed with worry upon hearing the news of his beloved wife's childbirth. The 2 duchesses, apprehensive that Matthias might display any unbecoming behavior that would betray his royal station, exchanged embarrassed glances that could not have been more divergent in nature. "Thank you, Grandma. And Mother." Matthias turned his gaze to his grandmother and mother with a serene countenance and spoke in a measured tone, his lips curled up into a gentle smile, one that was no different from his usual expression of composed elegance. As they engaged in some ceremonial small talk, the attendant made a reappearance, interrupting their conversation with news that the hospital room had been thoroughly cleaned and was now ready for their use. "We shall venture forth as a family once Felix awakens, so you go to Leyla first." Elise spoke to Matthias, as she lovingly patted her slumbering grandson's head, cradled securely in her arms. While she was uncertain of Matthias' thoughts on the matter, she felt that it was only fitting for Leyla to be greeted first by her husband. Matthias rose from his seat, offering a curt nod of acknowledgement before departing the VIP room. As he smoothed out the fabric of his clothes, the manner in which he exited seemed almost callous and detached. Leyla von Herhardt, watching her son's departure with a furrowed brow, could not help but feel a pang of disappointment. "I carried him in my heart all these years, yet I hardly recognize the man before me," she lamented, her gaze turning to Norma with a questioning glint in her eye. "How can he be so indifferent on a day like this, after what he had done for his wife?" In the waning days of the previous month, Matthias revealed his bold plan to relocate the final resting place of Bill Remmer, situated in Loveda, to the town of Berg. However, in order to expedite his plan, he required the full cooperation of Loveda's royal family. Although Leyla von Herhardt raised objections, Norma, being the wise matriarch that she is, ultimately acquiesced to her grandson's wishes. She understood all too well the profound sorrow of a child separated from their parents' graves in a distant land beyond the border. "What do you mean by parents?" Leyla von Herhardt inquired, pondering the true origins of the Duchess of Herhardt. "Does Matthias want to brazenly proclaim the empire that his wife is a gardener's daughter?" Leyla von Herhardt recoiled at the thought, yet found herself unable to resist until the bitter end. Tormented by the idea for days on end, she eventually relented, albeit with a caveat. She would never permit a gardener to be laid to rest in the family's hallowed cemetery. Luckily, her son possessed enough sanity to eschew such a brazen act. Instead, the gardener was interred in a new plot not too far from Arvis. And come springtime's end, Bill Remmer would slumber peacefully, gazing out upon the verdant forest he had so cherished in life. "The magnitude of love that we once shared cannot have dissipated overnight, but alas," sighed Leyla, her voice tinged with melancholy. "Today. Have a look at this, Leyla." Norma chuckled, gesturing towards the table's forefront where Matthias had been seated not long ago. Something glittering had caught her eye, resting beside the untouched teacup. It was none other than Matthias' cuff button. Leyla von Herhardt's pupils dilated in recognition as she pieced together the implications of this trinket's presence. "Sweet heavens above," gasped Leyla, unable to fathom that her usually composed son could have been responsible for such a fidgety blunder. What's more, she couldn't shake the memory of how he had carelessly left his belongings behind, neglecting to acknowledge the mess he had made of her outfit in the process. "Matthias, typically the epitome of cool and collected, was now evidently riddled with anxiety. By the heavens, Matthias. Those were the only words that escaped her lips. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. The VIP room was partitioned into two distinct areas, a reception room reserved for visitors and a separate hospital room designated for patients. Matthias traversed the corridor connecting these spaces with a measured gait, every footfall conjuring up memories of the child's conception, growth, and eventual emergence into the world. With newfound understanding, Matthias now comprehended the fullness of Leyla's pregnancy. Now he knew what was going through her mind during those trying months, and how much laughter had filled their lives. Leyla had expressed concerns over her appearance while pregnant, fretting needlessly over her beauty. But in reality, every passing moment only served to enhance her radiance in his eyes. Approaching the threshold of the hospital room, Matthias took a moment to collect himself before quietly crossing the threshold, his attendant trailing close behind. He had received word that both mother and child were in good health, but a tinge of trepidation gnawed at him nonetheless. It was a feeling that often arose whenever he found himself basking in seemingly unattainable happiness. Matthias thought to himself, what if everything is really an illusion? What if, upon awakening, he turned out to be only a man, abandoned and infatuated with a love you are unable to share? Matthias. A frail voice, barely above a whisper, drifted through the door of the hospital room, jolting his out of his reverie. As his gaze flicked towards the sound, he beheld Leyla lying prone on the bed, a mere shadow of her former self, her delicate frame dwarfed by the size of the mattress. Matthias. Once again, her lips curved upwards in a quiet smile, her voice barely a whisper as she called out to him. But even in her faintness, her smile shone like a beacon, illuminating Matthias' reality. For so long, he had yearned for her, drawing her smile in his mind's eye, but it was nothing compared to the beauty of this moment, this reality. As if drawn by an invisible force, Matthias stepped forward and enfolded Leyla in a fierce embrace. She reciprocated, her frail arms trembling as she wrapped them around him. Their embrace seemed to stretch on for an eternity, until finally, the nurse approached them, cradling the small bundle in her arms. Reluctantly, they pulled away, but their eyes remained locked, conveying a silent understanding and a love that transcended words. Leyla cradled the little bundle in her arms, her voice quivering as she whispered, "Isn't she beautiful?" Her face radiated with joy, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes. With a smile that could light up the darkest of nights, "Meet our daughter, Leah." The baby was wriggling contentedly in her sleep, almost as if she approved her mother's chosen name. Matthias gazed in awe at his daughter's locks, which were like a sun-kissed field of wheat. Leah. He ran his fingers through them, marveling at their silkiness and the way they seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. The little Princess Leyla von Herhardt had hair precisely like her mother. They were both golden and soft, seemingly endless in their abundance. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. The grave of the gardener was marked by a rose tree. Leyla personally planted the tree on his grave in the summer of the year the tomb was relocated. The tree improved in stature and beauty over the course of a year or so, reaching towards the sun and unfurling delicate shade of pink petals that shone like a beacon of hope, her most prized and beloved rose. "Mom. It's Grandpa," Felix exclaimed as he hovered over the grave. His voice brimming with confidence and excitement. Leyla's heart warmed at the sight of her son's enthusiasm. She beamed with pride and nodded, affirming his answer. "Felix, my little genius, you've done it again. You remembered Grandpa's resting place, didn't you?" When his mother lavished him with praise, the child confidently shouted the flower's proper name. "This is a rose." With a big smile on his face, Felix held the rose with both hands. Felix lovingly whispered the names of all the wonders that surrounded him, the endless expanse of sky, the towering trees, the fluttering birds, and the fluffy clouds. He eagerly shared their names with his toddling sister, while Leah babbled and cooed in response. Despite her incoherent noises, Felix persisted in teaching his little sister the magic of language. As Felix and Leah chattered like friendly birds, Leyla turned to Uncle Bill's grave and began speaking to him. She updated him on their lives, telling him about the peculiar and endearing things the children did at school, passing along greetings from the people of Arvis, and sharing news about Matthias. Leyla spoke of her relief in knowing that her husband was finally able to speak with a more comfortable mind. It wasn't until after Uncle Bill's funeral that Matthias shared this news with Leyla. Initially left speechless, she eventually burst into tears, finally able to release some of the deep guilt and longing she felt for leaving Uncle Bill alone in the distance. "Felix. Leah. As the sound of their names echoed through the air, Felix and Leah, inseparable siblings, turned towards their mother's voice. Holding each other's tiny hands tightly, they scurried towards her. With sparkling blue eyes, they gazed up at Leyla, who couldn't help but erupt in uncontrollable laughter at the sight of their innocent faces. Leyla had always heard people refer to her daughter as Blonde Matthias, a nickname that she didn't mind because it was an undeniable truth. But despite inheriting her mother's golden locks, little Leah was the spitting image of her father in every other way. "Just give up, Leyla," Leyla von Herhardt's eyes twinkled as she spoke, her voice carrying a gentle and knowing tone. "Have you ever been overwhelmed by the abundance of portraits of the Herhardt family?" Leyla pondered for a while and eventually unraveled the enigmatic query. The Herhardt family portraits bore a striking resemblance to Matthias and their children. Elise paused and gazed at her daughter-in-law with admiration. "It's a gene that's hard to beat," she said with a serious tone. "Having the same hair color as you is like a victory." As she spoke, she realized that the only thing Leyla had passed down to Leah was the color of her hair. "Felix, Leah, let's pay our respects to your grandfather," Leyla said, her voice now somber as she led them towards Uncle Bill's tombstone. As they approached, Layla's eyes grew heavy with emotion as she gazed upon Leah's little white shoes. "Grandpa, I'll be right back." Felix mustered up his courage and greeted his grandfather in the most respectful manner he could. The way Felix pronounced Grandpa with such childlike innocence was like a sweet melody that filled the air and warmed Layla's heart. In time for lunch, Leyla and her children returned to the mansion. Matthias went out to attend a luncheon meeting, so there were just 3 Duchess servings on the table. Middle. As the last course was served, Leyla took a deep breath and summoned the courage to share her plan. "I have been contemplating the idea for a while now, and I wanted to ask if it would be possible to use the forest cabin as my laboratory?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "A lab?" Casting a curious gaze towards Leyla, Norma said, "Now this could be just the place for you. With your focus on studying plants and birds, having them in such close proximity could be quite advantageous. What say you, Elise? Do you think it's worth considering?" Leyla fixed her gaze on Elise von Herhardt's face. "What does our consent mean when it's yours anyway?" Elise gave Leyla a slightly frowning glance. A scowl marred her face as she flashed a bitter smile. "But, this Arvis is within your remit, therefore, I must ask for your approval." Layla's grin was forced and her face was clearly tense. The unpleasant expression on Elise von Herhardt's face was matched by a smile around her lips. "It seems that furthering your education is still part of your plan." Norma's keen observation led her to remark. Caught off guard, Leyla responded hesitantly, "What? Oh. Yes." Elise contemplated for a moment before expressing her opinion. "Allowing your exceptional intellect to go to waste would be a travesty. Have you considered the possibility of becoming a professor at Ratz University, perhaps under the title of Duchess of Herhardt?" She continued, "In my humble opinion that would be an excellent use of your talents." "Professor?" The word reverberated in Layla's mind, leaving her taken aback. While she had always planned to pursue further education after completing her undergraduate studies, she had not yet considered any concrete objectives beyond that. Well, what do we have here?" she mused. "Isn't it possible that being a professor might be a better fit for you than being a social queen?" Elise's playful banter stirred something within Leyla, causing her to realize that Elise's influence on Matthias ran deeper than just her physical appearance. "Give it your all, my dear." Elise's gaze fixed upon Leyla as she spoke in a soft tone that echoed that of her son. "The cabin is yours to do with as you please. Middle. Daddy." Felix's exuberant voice pierced through the air as he spotted the sleek black car pulling up to the annex. Leyla and Leah, who had been admiring the colorful blooms that lined the road, were startled by the sudden outburst and turned their heads in surprise. As the driver opened the back door, Matthias emerged, fulfilling his promise to take the children out on a boat. Leyla quickly wiped the blades of grass from her fingers with a hastily retrieved handkerchief, while Felix bolted towards his father with unbridled enthusiasm. Not to be outdone, Leah followed closely behind, her own excitement palpable in the air. Leyla trailed behind the group, her steps measured and deliberate as she scanned the surrounding area for any sign of danger. Her dress, a delicate confection of colored fabric, fluttered in the gentle breeze, while the lace ribbon of her straw hat danced beneath her chin. Her hair cascaded down her neck in loose waves, lending her an air of ethereal grace. Matthias looked at them with wonder. The image of his family frolic enjoying the river in the summer was seared into his mind. He didn't care which of the children looked like whom, what mattered was that they were safe and happy. Looking at Leah one day, for a moment, Layla's words from a long-ago conversation flitted through his mind, but instead of admitting that he had shared her wish, he simply smiled to himself. In truth, Matthias had always harbored a secret desire for a daughter who resembled Leyla. Leyla wished for it, and it was agreed that all men feel who love their wife. But, as he held her in his arms, watching her slip into a peaceful slumber, his heart overflowed with a fierce, possessive love. He felt an entirely different kind of longing. Yes, he was still crazy about her. And he knew that no matter what the future held, she would always be the one and only woman for him. Let there be just one Leyla, for she was irreplaceable. And, let him be the only man in the world to have a woman like her. Always, in the present, future, and for all time. When the moment came as she had given herself over to slumber, he leaned in and placed a soft kiss on her forehead, then on her cheek, and her parted lips, savoring the sweetness of her skin. When he ran his fingers through her hair and caressed the bridge of her nose, a sweet smile bloomed on her lips. He was a less than perfect husband no matter how hard he tried, and his twisted love for her may have lasted till he reaches the bottom of his grave. Certainly, the way he loved was twisted. Imperfect, but it was still so good. If only Leyla could be his Leyla forever. Matthias took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the two children running towards him. Felix was in his arms again today, delivering his innocent love with a kiss on his cheek. Matthias returned his son's kiss and gave the same love to Leah, who became his new joy. "Matty, you're back sooner than I expected." Leyla approached, taking a few steps closer to him. His Leyla, whose smile was the brightest and most beautiful thing in the world. Matthias carefully handed over his wriggling son to her and cradled his daughter in his arms, stepping closer to his wife. Warm and tender kisses were shared amid their hearty mirth. In that moment, Matthias wished for nothing more than for her love to remain unchanged. May she always be bathed in the same warm, comforting glow of love, enough to ease the painful memories of her difficult childhood and the hurts he had inflicted upon her. Now that he realized they shared the same love, albeit in a different way. In fact, it didn't matter for if he loved her more. If love had a spectrum of light and shadow, Matthias was willing to stand by her side even if it meant facing the darkest shadows. Because his own happiness was in the radiance of Layla's light. As he extended his hand, Leyla clasped it without hesitation, and together they strolled along the shimmering riverbank. With their daughter cradled in his arms and their son holding his mother's hand, they were now a family of four. As they passed beneath Layla's cherished tree, Matthias turned his head and gazed back at the path they had just taken. His eyes traveled through the heavenly Arvis laid before him. The verdant forest. The glittering river. And the azure sky filled with soaring birds. Until they finally came to rest upon her face. Leyla. Following a velvety voice that called her name, Leyla turned her head. When her eyes caught his, her smile became even more radiant. The afternoon was awash with the beauty of an endless summer forest, shimmering and alive. The end.